Okay, Mayor Wong, we are live.
Great, thank you. Good evening and welcome to the July 14, 2020 City Council Special Video Meeting. I'm Mayor Benson Wong. Prior to tonight's virtual City Council meeting, Council held an executive session for approximately 45 minutes using video conferencing technology provided by Microsoft Teams to discuss planning or adopting the strategy or position to be taken by the City Council during the course of any collective bargaining, professional negotiations, or grievance or mediation proceedings, or reviewing the proposals made in the negotiations or proceedings while in progress pursuant to RCW 42.30.140.
No, I didn't know it was at the house. It wasn't at the house when I was there last.
Somebody needs to mute.
I'll get it. It's not.
140, paren 4, close paren B, close paren. And we spent another 15 minutes to discuss with legal counsel pending or potential litigation pursuant to RCW 42.30.110, paren 1, close paren I, close paren. No action was taken. Tonight's special meeting is being brought to you using video conferencing technology provided by Zoom. We are also broadcasting live on MITV Channel 21 and on the city's YouTube channel. City Manager Jesse Bond and some staff members will be participating in tonight's meeting while in the City Council chambers and maintaining the recommended social distancing. City Attorney Beal Park and some other staff members will be participating in tonight's meeting remotely. Public audience members are listening to the meeting by telephone or using the Zoom teleconferencing application. We welcome all of you and thank you for joining tonight's meeting. Council members, roll call will be taken during the course of the evening. And so we ask that you have your microphones turned on while the City Clerk, Deb Estrada, conducts those roll calls. She'll be doing these roll calls so that we can accurately capture everybody's vote. City Clerk, please take the roll. City Clerk, please take the roll.
My space bar didn't want to work to let me off mute. Okay, Mayor Benson Wong.
Here.
Councilmember Neese.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Wendy Weicker.
Here.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Here.
Councilmember Anderl.
Here.
Councilmember Rosenbaum.
Here.
And Councilmember Jacobson.
Here.
Great, thank you. We now move to our first item of business, which is to approve the amended agenda that was sent out by our city clerk yesterday. Before in motion, I want to state that while Governor Inslee's proclamation number 28-28.7 regarding the Open Public Meetings Act extends the statutory waivers and suspensions through August 1, it no longer contains no longer contains restrictions on what actions may be taken by the governing body. Council, may I have a motion to approve the amended agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
So it's been moved by Councilmember Rosenbaum and seconded
Good boy, Henry. Eat your dinner.
Reynolds to approve the amended agenda. City Clerk, please take the roll.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Anderl.
Aye.
Councilmember Neese.
Aye.
Councilmember Rosenbaum.
Aye.
Councilmember Jacobson.
Aye.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Weicker.
Aye.
And Mayor Wong.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Motion passes and the amended agenda is approved. For this meeting, we continue to utilize the Zoom platform as part of our meeting. If a council member has a question, the council member will use the raise his or her hand feature. I'll do my best to recognize council members in the order that they raise their hands. Council members are encouraged to ask only one question with perhaps one follow-up question in order to allow other council members an opportunity to ask their questions before a council member has a second chance to ask a question. Tonight's agenda will not include in-person public appearances in accordance with Proclamation 20-28.7 and the governor's extended stay-home order. However, individuals wishing to speak live during the appearances portion of our meeting may do so by telephone or using the Zoom teleconferencing application, provided, however, they have registered their desire to speak with the city clerk's office by 4 p.m. today. Our city clerk will call on you by name or telephone number when it's your turn to speak. This is an opportunity for anyone to speak to the city council on any item. All remarks will be addressed to the council as a whole and not to any individual council member or individual staff member. If any person makes personal, impertinent or slanderous remarks or becomes boisterous, threatening, or personally abusive while addressing the council, I may request that the person leave the meeting. When it is your turn to address the council, be sure to speak audibly, state your name for the record, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. The city clerk will provide a 15-second warning when your time is about to expire. That said, there will be a small variation in tonight's appearances. On July 7th, during our regular meeting, Ms. Meg Lippert was scheduled to speak, but due to audio challenges, was unable to do so. In accordance with the City Council Rules of Procedure 3.3G, the mayor may grant additional time for citizen comments. I'm therefore granting Ms. Lippert 2 opportunities to speak tonight for 3 minutes each this evening. City Clerk, is anybody signed up for appearances?
Thank you, Mayor. We have 4 individuals. We have Ms. Meg Lippert, we have Bharat Shah, Ms. Addie Smith, and Ira Appleman. Meg Lippert is the first person to speak, and I will start the timer when she starts speaking.
Thank you.
Ms. Lippert,
Can you hear me?
we can.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Meg Lippert, Mercer Island. I'm speaking as an individual citizen. I'm not speaking as a representative or as a member of any organization or group. The views I will express are my own. You voted at your last meeting to allocate $50,000 to design a recycling center remodel that would not extend beyond the current roof line. I am concerned about the protection and preservation of public parkland. Can you hear me still? Specific Mercer Park, including the native plant garden. I'm sorry, I'm taking care of my granddaughter here. I'm trying to do a lot of things. Please respond to the following questions that are focused on the protection of public parkland for the public good. 1, what guarantees have you put into place to prevent further encroachment into Mercerdale Park once the recycling center porch area is enclosed? 2, how will you ensure that staging for the construction will not encroach on Mercerdale Park or the native garden? 3, how will you ensure that the native plant garden will be protected from damage during construction? 4, at this point, 1 trailer is on site to receive goods that will be resold in bulk, but that are not acceptable for sale at the thrift store. Will the proposed remodel eliminate the need for this trailer, which is an eyesore in our park, or will this and additional trailers and/or storage containers be added to the site, which will not only be an eyesore, but will also attract vermin? 5, have you thought about how goods will be transported from the recycling center to the thrift shop? If staff will be trundling goods in wagons and/or shopping carts between the venues on pedestrian paths used by park patrons, what would prevent the City Council from voting to widen the paths, thus decreasing green space? My biggest concern is that our City Council should be protecting our parks. I think that before this project is approved, the City Council should enact legislation to assure citizens that no additional projects will be built in the park, and that enclosing the porch area of the recycling center will not lead to its further expansion into the park. Citizens need to be assured that this is not just the first step to build other projects in the park. Finally, citizens need assurance that current public street parking on the south side of 32nd Street, currently used by Mercerdale Park visitors, will not be co-opted for thrift shop drop-offs and reconfigured at a loss to our community for users of Mercerdale Park. Inconceivable as this seems, remember that in the past, the spaces bordering the northern edge of Mercerdale Park were planned for use by MICA as handicapped parking slots for their patrons. Okay, and I yield the rest of my time for this first appearance.
Meg, you're welcome to continue into your second appearance.
Okay, just a minute here. I have to get that up.
Would you like us to come back to you, Meg?
I've got it. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Wong, for allowing me to present two appearances this evening. One, my statement from last week, which you just heard, and two, a second statement on a follow-up subject, which is this one, focused on the challenges of public feedback to city council members during city council meetings. It turned out that there were three contributing factors that led to my not being able to be heard last week. First, the confirmation email from the city was unclear to me. I took, quote, "We will call on you by the phone number you provided," end quote, to mean that, quote, "We will call you," end quote, since the email specifically mentioned that the city had my telephone number. But that was not the case. The city clerk, quote, "calls on," end quote, citizens who have signed up to speak, but she does not, quote, "call," end quote, them on their phones to speak. Second, after I heard the city clerk saying that it was my turn to speak, but you couldn't hear me, that's when I sent the email to the city clerk, CCing all of you, asking to be given another chance to deliver my appearance right after the break last week, which was denied me. Third, it turned out that the microphone on my phone needed to be turned on following a three-step procedure that I was not aware of. Click on settings, click on privacy, click on unmute Zoom. This might be old hat to all of you, but it wasn't to me, and I was extremely disappointed and angry that I could not give the appearance I had prepared. The reason I'm speaking about this now is that my difficulties made me realize that there may be others who have in the past few weeks faced, or who might face in the future, similar challenges when trying to participate in city government. To avoid silencing citizens who wish to speak to their representatives, even inadvertently silencing them, I hope that the city will take these two steps. One, clarify the language and procedures on the city webpage and the city calendar page. For example, use, quote, "unmute," end quote, instead of, quote, "call on," end quote. Because citizens cannot unmute themselves, the city clerk must do so. And I want to note that some changes have been already put on that website, which is great, telling people to unmute their own microphone before they speak. Two, in the event that citizens cannot present an appearance due to technical difficulties at one meeting, that they be permitted to present two appearances at the following meeting, as you've done. And thank you very much, Mayor Wong, for that privilege. Finally, to make the virtual appearances as informative and vivid as possible, I think that citizens as well as council members should be enabled to speak on video. Seeing a person present their views is much more compelling than simply listening to audio of citizens, which would be equivalent to hiding them behind screens at City Hall for appearances and letting them speak through the cracks of the screens. And if there was an unacceptable image or action that could quickly be taken off the screen by the city clerk. Okay, and I finally want to add that I really appreciate the city's clerk helping work through my challenges from last week so that I'm able to present these two appearances, and scheduling a private meeting with me on Friday so that I could actually work through those problems. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Deb, for all the work that you've done. I know that sometimes this can be technically sometimes a challenge, so thank you for that.
Mr. Mayor, our second person on the appearances list is Bharat Shah. Bharat, if you could please there you go.
Yeah. Can you folks hear me now?
We can, sir.
All right. Thank you, Deborah. This is Bharat Sham, 8405 Southeast 34th Place. Before I get to the topic that I really want to touch on, I feel like I need to have a little bit of a preamble. So here goes. I have 4 African-American nephews and nieces. One of them is a tall, 21-year-old, very dark-skinned sportsman and a very gentle soul. And the person he loves more than anyone is his mother, my sister-in-law, who also works in law enforcement in a big city. My daughter raised $54,000 for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I have a Black Lives Matter yard sign on my property. And I fully acknowledge that my opportunities as an immigrant in the United States were only possible because of the struggles of people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks. And I've taken the implicit bias test from Harvard University several times, and I repeatedly test as being biased in favor of African Americans. Now, with that preamble, I'm here to speak vociferously in favor of the Mercer Island Police Department. I would like to recommend that their funding be increased so they can deal with the pressures of their work. If you look at statistics, far more African Americans die due to law and order problems than due to inequities in our legal system, although those inequities in our legal system are real and need to be addressed. And it's possible that we have people who are racist in our city government or in our police force. That's a possibility because human beings, like many species, have a tribal bias, and race is but a tribe. However, this bias can be acknowledged and unlearned, and we need extra funding so we can help police officers work through any biases that they may have. I want to call attention to a few headlines that passed through my news feed on Friday and Saturday and then again today. I'll just read them out to you. One person shot in Bellevue, suspect flees, police say. Second headline, Sammamish man, 68, arrested after shooting at a deputy checking in on his well-being. It was just an open garage, and the deputy knocked on the door and was shot at. Third headline, 2 dead, 2 hurt in shooting and stabbing in downtown Bellevue, domestic violence. 1 police officer killed and 1 injured at a traffic stop in Bothell. That was yesterday. This is just a regular traffic stop. Someone pulled out a gun and shot a police officer and killed him. So we're going through an unprecedentedly challenging time in our society, fueled by hate from the White House. This is very unusual. We haven't faced anything like this for 80 years. This may persist for a year or maybe even for 5 years. This is the time where we have to put more funding into MIYFS, more funding into Mercer Island Police Department, so that we're the best police force in America. This is not the time to defund the police because there's no data that exists to show that defunding the police will make anyone safer. Finally, I want to thank Chief Holmes and all of you for your leadership and patience in these extraordinary times, especially council members who have had to sort of bear the brunt when they have disagreed with me. And so I really thank them for all their grace. And I want to thank every police officer who's treated me with extraordinary grace and respect, even when I have sometimes broken the law, such as blowing through a red light and endangering others. So I urge you to treat these brave, altruistic men and women with the respect that they deserve and give them the funding that they deserve. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. City Clerk?
Mr. Mayor, the third person on our list is Ms. Addie Smith.
Hi. So I did have something I wanted to say in response to the other caller. I too am an African-American woman. I am from Nigeria. I have a biracial daughter and 2 biracial sons. I am a hate crime survivor right here on Mercer Island, and I do believe that we need to decrease funding to police officers on Mercer Island. They don't need training to know how to be human beings, especially when they know it, when they apprehend white offenders, if that happens. And from my perspective, I do not see where that has occurred. I don't believe that Black people are safe, specifically speaking for myself and my daughter here on Mercer Island. And it gives me really huge cause for concern when I hear other people that say Black Lives Matter and have no clue, in my opinion, what that entails when it comes to safety and policing safety and having police make decisions as if they're attorneys when matters occur between people of different races. I'm going to leave it at that for now, but I do believe that we need to decrease police funding. At any rate, I wanted to respond to a couple of things that I heard from the last meeting. In particular, one of the council members who said specifically that that new housing is less affordable than old housing, and that is totally false. I am a specialist in housing credit management. I am also a housing credit certified professional. and a certified professional of occupancy. I am the former manager of the Hadley apartment, and that statement is totally false. First of all, the rent is going to be based on what's trending in the market in this area. So they're not going to go higher in rent than, say, the Mercer, for example, or the Aviara, unless there is some particular reason it might go $200 or $300 above what is actually trending. And in terms of affordable housing, the rent is based off of a median income that is set by HUD. So that idea that new housing is going to be less affordable than old housing is completely and totally false, and it is not based or founded in any fact or any background check or knowledge or any other sort. So, and I also wanted to respond to something that was questionable about repealing the MFPE funding. So I want to give you a little bit of information, and I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. You can get my email if you have additional questions from Deb. First, you have to understand that cities decide how much tax revenue to levy, not the tax rate itself, and that this amount is limited to 1% above what they levied the prior year, plus
Ms.
taxes
Lippert?
on new construction.
Ms. Lippert, you have 10 seconds left in your appearances.
So the last thing, so then the last 10 seconds, I wanted to address the real problem, and that is the fee waivers that the city gives. The city council and the city managers are supposed to be responsible for oversight of the affordable housing, and they are not doing that. They're supposed to be sending applicants to these housing apartments to let them know people that are applying for apartments, and they are not doing that. They're supposed to be managing the date and time stamp according to state and federal housing to make sure that a person who qualifies is not picked over someone who does not, for example, and that the city council and city hall are not doing that. I don't know if I'm still talking. Can anybody still hear me or no?
We can, ma'am, but your time is up.
So if anybody wants me to continue, I would like to continue on that fee waiver issue, because that fee waiver issue is huge, because you guys are giving thousands of dollars in fee waivers to companies, to development, and you're not monitoring to make sure that that the people who qualify are living in these apartments, and I can tell you they're not. So I'll speak at the next one, but there's a lot of issues, and MFPE is not one of them, and I think you should not repeal it.
Thank you. Dad, do we have another speaker?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, we have Ira Appleman. Mr. Appleman, are you ready?
Muting.
We can hear you now, sir.
Thank you. Ira Appleman, Mercer Island. At the last city council meeting, I objected to the rushed 4-month building project in Mercerdale Park that the city council is pursuing without any public input or public participation. The city council is violating the Open Public Meetings Act by excluding the public and making decisions critical to our community. These virtual meetings effectively cut out the public and have convinced the city council that the public doesn't really matter anymore. At one virtual meeting, the public wasn't watching because of technical errors that didn't let the public in. Yet the city council didn't care about the illegality of the meeting and simply posted it online anyway. When the city council suspended the consideration of projects at open public meetings, the city manager promised at her April 2nd, 2020 online briefing that, quote, "Here's what I can tell you, Mercer Island community. There won't be any surprises. When the work begins again, we will provide you with ample notice," unquote. That promise has been broken. In my article in the August 23rd, 2017 Mercer Island Reporter titled Mercerdale Park and the Struggle to Resist Urbanization, I briefly outlined the sensitivity of building projects proposed to destroy Mercerdale Park. In 1985, the city proposed replacing the park with a civic center plan to include most city buildings, which was rejected by islanders. proponents changed strategy, deciding that the first volley to destroy the park should include only one building, followed later by the others. In a 1987 vote, Islanders rejected building City Hall at Mercerdale. In 1997, Islanders rose up to reject building the fire station in the park. And more recently, Islanders rose up again to reject a performing arts center in the park. As the Open Public Meetings Act states, quote, "The people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created." And I emphasize control. The city should immediately suspend all expenditures and put this project on hold until substantial public input and involvement has occurred and until the city council has identified protections for the park to make sure this project isn't the first volley in an attack to destroy Mercerdale Park, which past city councils have so often tried. And I would also like to associate myself with the remarks of Bharat, with Bharat's statement in supporting the police. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. Any other speakers, Deb?
That's all, sir.
Thank you. We now move to the first study session item, Agenda Bill 5724, Police Operations Report. And for that, welcome Police Chief Ed Holmes.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question real quick?
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to associate myself with the comments about the tragic death of the police officers in our area. It was really tough to see and awful. And Deb, I have a question for you. Are we not able to do video commentary or video appearances?
To answer your question, we are able to do video appearances. It's a decision that staff discussed several times early on due to the issues with Zoom bombing and the fact that in the council chambers, we have a controlled environment where we know what the backdrop is. We know we can control everything that's going on in that room. When we have people in a virtual capacity that are attendees that we haven't practiced with. We've practiced with all of you. We've practiced with all of our participants. We don't want something to pop up on a video screen that maybe isn't family friendly. And so that's why we have avoided that.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I had Mr. Schramm, if that's the correct pronunciation. I saw his video. Maybe that was only his picture, but because he had a mask on, so I couldn't tell.
It's his picture.
Okay.
So council, this is not on our agenda this evening. I'm happy to pick it up with you at another time. I do recommend we move to our agenda items, and we'd be happy to discuss this further at a future date.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Police Chief Ed Holmes.
Okay, thank you, council members. And before I start here, I'll just say thank you, Councilmember Rosenbaum, for your comments. I also got a call from Councilmember Andrel in reference to the shooting of the Botha police officers, the one who passed away. So I appreciate the sentiment and other words of support I've received. Tonight, again, for the record, Ed Holmes, your police chief. And tonight I have with me Sergeant Mike Seifert. He is our personnel and training sergeant. He's been with the department for 10 years. Prior to coming to us, he was with the U.S. Army, and he is our firearms and use of force expert, so I lean on him pretty heavily. Mike, you want to say a quick hi?
Just thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be able to talk about some of the good things that we're doing here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, and I'm going to now attempt to share my screen. And Mayor, can you give me a head nod if this is working? Okay, thank you. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about Mercer Island Police Department operations, and specifically under the umbrella of public trust. So policing in America, you know, this is a challenging time. I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you. and particularly in the area of public trust in our communities across the country. And so I thought, in light of a lot of questions I've received from council members, from community members, I thought it would be appropriate, then at the request of City Manager Bond, to do a highlight tonight on the things we do here at Mercer Island in, I guess, the following 5 areas. We'll talk tonight about our initial training, our initial hiring process, rather. We'll talk about initial training. We'll talk about our policies. I want to talk about ongoing training and then accountability. So on our first topic of hiring, I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Mike Seifert to speak about our hiring process. Mike.
So being such a small agency, we need to really make sure that we put a lot of attention to detail into having the candidates that we have that make it into the hiring process. So our hiring process starts with an outside company called Public Safety Testing. They do a written and physical exam, and from that we take the scores from the written exam. The physical is just a pass-fail, and that are the people that we invite to our initial oral board testings. Our oral boards are usually made up of somebody from Human Resources on the city side, a supervisor, an officer, and if we have a support member available from our police department, we'll have them be a member of the board as well. Each of the board members will then interview the candidate together, and we will have a list of people that make it through the candidate testing process there, and that will give us our civil service lists. Once we have the civil service list, that allows us to enable the background process for each of our candidates. And that background process is very extensive. That's where we eliminate quite a few candidates based for several reasons. Sometimes it's fit on Mercer Island. Sometimes they don't seem to be like they'll be able to do the job of law enforcement very well. We're able to take into account any type of discrimination. We do family interviews, previous work interviews, educational interviews, do everything we can to get to know this person. And one of the nice things about Mercer Island is we're able to do all those background investigations in-house. We have several trained background investigators for the department, which the chief trusts. He's allowed to actually talk to those people and get more of a one-to-one feel based on the person that he's talking to, so that he knows that the background information he's been given is solid and somebody who wants to work with that person in the future. And I would also add that all of our background investigations, in fact, all law enforcement background investigations, have a polygraph exam as part of the background investigation to ensure that the candidate has been truthful during the process. After we have the candidates that have passed the background investigation, they will be invited. We have a roll of 5, so up to 5 candidates can be interviewed for each position by the chief. We call that the chief's interview. It's actually a very conversational interview with both the chief and our services and operations commanders. From there, they get to decide who they like based on everything they've had from the process, whether it's the scores, background investigation, the conversation they get to have with them, and deem who's going to be given the conditional offer of a job based on best fit from everything they've taken into account. The conditions of that conditional offer are medical based. Basically, they have to pass a physical and a psychological exam. Once a candidate has passed one of those, they'll be given an unconditional job offer and be welcomed to the beginning part of being a Mercer Island police officer. Next slide. Then we get into our training process. All of our new officers start with an 18-month probationary period, and this is a time where they're consistently challenged, tested, and they're for a lot of things, not only to make sure they can do the job of law enforcement, that they'll be able to do it in a way that upholds the standards and values that we have here on Mercer Island. We break this training into the bullets that you can see on that slide there. Pre-academy training is varied among different officers based on when they're hired and when they're able to get into the academy. So we currently have few officers that are waiting to begin the academy due to delayed entry because of the COVID responses that are going on. And during this time, we're able to train them in all kinds of Mercer Island specific things. We try not to do too much of the initial law enforcement training because we want to leave that for the academy. But they're able to work with multiple departments, multiple sections, multiple officers. And every time they're working with somebody, they get I wouldn't say evaluated, but if something concerns one of the officers that is working here, they can bring that up. And that's something that can be either addressed, or if the person is deemed not to be a fit here, they can be let go. The basic law enforcement academy is just that. It's a 720-hour, usually a 19-week class where they get everything they need from the state that's mandated to be a police officer here. After that, they spend about 2 weeks in what we call post-academy training. And during that time, we just do some Mercer Island specific honing in on the skills they learned at BLEA. Then they get into the real part of what makes somebody a police officer here, and that's the field training officer program. Usually about 14 weeks is how long it takes for officers to get through that. And during that time, they'll work for about a month each with a field training officer, somebody who's been trained to teach, educate, and evaluate officer candidates through the process. After they've completed that process, if they've completed that process, we have a pretty high rate, but not everybody makes it through. They will do whatever's left of their 18-month initial probationary period in what we call phase 3 training. And phase 3 training is where they really get tested, really get to make sure they're a good fit here because they're doing most of what they're doing on their own. They're still working in a squad. They'll have supervisors and senior officers to work with, and they're encouraged to use those people for assistance and help when they can. But in the end, they're evaluated each month, and right prior to their probationary period being over, all of those evaluations are looked at by the personnel and training sergeant, by the command staff, and the chief. And then we make a decision if that officer is going to be given a permanent position. For our policies, we use a company called Lexipol. Lexipol is a nationwide, or if not international, company that specializes in writing and reviewing and keeping up-to-date policies for police departments. So what they give us that we wouldn't be able to get anywhere else for at least the price that we're given is a very thorough investigation into the state laws, state best practices, national best practices, and then they keep us up to date and pretty frequently push out changes and revisions that need to be done or that are recommended by what's going on both in the nation and the state. Another thing that Lexipol offers that's pretty handy for us is the daily training bulletins. These are just basically training scenarios where an officer logs into their online profile. They'll able to read a scenario, ask a question about that scenario, and then given a little educational blurb about the policy that applies to that scenario. They then take a test, which is just a simple question at the end. And if they get it wrong, they have to keep taking it until they get it right. This allows me as the personnel training sergeant to log in and see that everybody's taking these daily training bulletins. Whoops. And also to address any issues or any confusions about policies that we're currently using, which is pretty frequent. We have good police officers here, so they want to get really into the minutia and details of each policy. And when I push out the policies at the beginning each month, I often get emails asking for clarifications or wanting to talk about the scenario didn't really fit. So we have really analytical officers that take our policies seriously. Big topic right now is, of course, use of force policy. Our use of force policy, the best way to put it is just to read it how it's written, is that all of our officers shall only use the amount of force that is reasonably appears necessary given the facts and circumstances perceived by the officer at the time of the event to accomplish a lawful law enforcement purpose. That is what the Constitution tells us to do. That is what case law tells us to do. And that is what every officer in this department is trained and taught to do. We do not allow neck restraints unless it's a case of life or death fight. All of our officers have a duty to not only intervene if they witness a fellow officer using excessive force, but they are to immediately report that to a supervisor. We do have a policy that says verbal warnings will be given before using lethal force when it's feasible. And all of our applications of force, so anytime we do anything that's physical force, if we're to point a firearm, if we're to point our taser at somebody, that would generate a use of force report, which would be every officer involved, as well as the supervisor who would investigate that use of force. Our bias-based policing policy, again, sometimes it's best just to read right from it. And MIPD is committed to providing law enforcement services to the community with due regard for racial, cultural, and other differences of those served. We provide law enforcement services and enforce the law equally, fairly, objectively, and without discrimination toward any individual group. And of the many things that our chief takes seriously, that is probably, I'd say, the top of his list. As he said, I get to do the use of force and firearm side, so that's something that I've received excess hours of training on, been able to bring my passion to this department, while the chief brings his passions as well. And bias-based policing to making sure that he has an equitable and fair and honorable police department is definitely something that he has done the entire time that I've been here.
Sergeant, excuse me. City Manager Jesse Bond, did you have a question or comment?
Mr. Mayor, City Manager Bond had to step away for a few minutes and she should be back shortly.
Oh, okay. I heard somebody's voice. Okay.
That was my voice. I was trying to get the chief to turn off his mic. I think Sergeant Seifert's presentation was being heard over the chief's microphone.
Has it been corrected?
Well, neither of them are speaking right now.
Oh,
So
go ahead, Sergeant. We'll find a time for, I suspect there's a lot of questions, so go ahead.
So going on to the next slide of ongoing training. Yeah, I think it's fixed now. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so per state law, which is the minimum that officers in the state of Washington are required to do, is 24 hours of annual training. And the way they define their training is basically anything that could be used universally amongst the law enforcement agencies of the state. We usually surpass that very easily. We take training very seriously in this department. We're lucky to actually work in a jurisdiction where we're not having to do high-risk call from high-risk call from high-risk call. So we have to make sure that our officers are trained to deal with that on the rare occurrences that we do have to deal with it. Our officers, I would say, average between maybe as low as 30 to 40 hours a year to high up into hundreds of hours if they've done some sort of very specialized training during a year. So training is something that we have taken very seriously and something that the city has encouraged and taken care of us as far as we can get it. And I think the chief's going to take this next bullet here.
Mute yours. Okay, so ongoing training, a part of that is done through the Coalition of Small Police Agencies. There are probably, I think, 12 police agencies that we pool our resources together. They have trainers in certain areas, so we don't have to. So we do a lot of sharing. We have an interlocal agreement with the Coalition of Small Police Agencies. And one of the things we do with them is our annual training in the area of anti-bias policing. To speak to this, I want to spend just a couple minutes on a little bit of history, how we got to this bit of training with the Coalition of Small Police Agencies. So if you can bear with me, I'll try to just be a minute or two on this. I guess it's almost a story. But in 2011, so some time ago, I had a complaint in my office. It was a racial profiling complaint. And there were 4 people in my office, the woman and her husband and a couple of their friends. And it was a 2-hour meeting that was both stressful and strangely wonderful at the same time, if I could describe it like that. At the end of the meeting, they asked me a really hard question. They asked me, what do you do in the area of training for diversity and cultural awareness? What do you do in the area of training? And I had a choice to make. I could either say, hey, we do our annual training and try to move on quickly, or I could give the more perhaps thorough and more honest answer, which is what I chose to do. And I said, you know what? We watch the same DVD every year. We mark up, check a little box, and we count that as our training. And I said, because I don't know where to turn to get good training in this area. We had a not so good experience a number of years earlier, and ever since then, I just didn't know where to turn to. So they sincerely appreciated my candor and my honesty. And they got me in touch with the first picture you see on that, the upper picture, Captain with Seattle Police Department, John Hayes. So the very next week, I reached out to John Hayes and I said, hey, here's who I am. Here's what I'm facing. We need to do training in this area, and we really don't, other than a DVD. And I don't really count that as meaningful training. So John came to the department. He did the training. He did the training for the first couple of years. And then he started bringing guests with him in the subsequent years. He brought someone from the Native American community, from the Chinese community. We've had trainers from the Muslim community, from the Hispanic community, trying to train our officers how to do our policing better with different groups of people we encounter. We've also had the help of that second picture there, Wayne Perryman, Black pastor here on the island, very helpful to me personally and helpful to us as a department. Wayne has come, as has John Hayes, to the Coalition of Small Police Agencies. So we've done training with the coalition, coalition-wide, trying to evangelize some of this training because it's training that we need. And if we get the right trainers, it's really, really helpful. So we have done quite a bit of training. The most recent training we did was implicit bias training, and that was at the police academy. So that was like region wide. That was excellent training. In hindsight, I think if I had to sequence this training all over again, I would have certainly started with implicit bias training as our first element of training, and then building on that. So for anybody watching this who hasn't done much of any training in this area, I would strongly suggest looking at and exploring implicit bias as your place to start, and then build off of that. So we continue to do annual training with the Coalition of Small Police Agencies in this area, and I envision us continuing to do that in the future. So I will then let Mike take over here with crisis intervention training.
So crisis intervention training is something that CJTC and the Basic Law Enforcement Academy and King County have really been prepared for going on about 10 years now. And they have pushed out a very effective and significant program that offers training in multiple different ways. They have a week-long training program. There's an 8-hour training program for those to basically have an intro. There's now a CIT training block that's part of the Basic Law Enforcement Academy. They have CIT that focuses with youth, CIT actually use of force options, communications and mental health classes. And then as of legislation requiring in 2018, there's now an online 2-hour class that's presented and every officer in the state must take once a year. So our department has gotten in pretty quickly with that. We started sending people to the 40-hour class when it was available, and starting in either 2010, 2011. The average number of hours we have per officer here is about 42.5 hours. We have several new officers that haven't made the eligibility list to be able to attend this training, but we make that a priority to send them when they do. And for those that don't know what CIT is, it's basically training that focuses on people in crisis and how officers can help to assist them, and if at all possible, avoid it becoming a further legal or use of force event. And the training includes things like the legal aspects of assisting people, identifying mental health disorders that you might be dealing with in order to more appropriately tailor your response, the interpersonal relationships necessary to effectively work not only with the person in crisis, but maybe their family or friends that are there at the scene, and then intervention strategies that we can use for both low and high risk situations for somebody that's in crisis. De-escalation and use of force, which is the last bullet there. We have had de-escalation training for as long as I've been a police officer. It's one of those things that everyone's always done and has kind of taken for granted. And now that we're putting titles on it and trying to better identify it, I think people are starting to understand it a little bit better. But the way that we've addressed is we get officers that are receiving specific de-escalation training in an area that's important to have it, and then we integrate that into an area. So one of the initial issues when de-escalation became something that was talked about frequently was officers started to separate, hey, am I supposed to de-escalate? Am I supposed to use force? Am I supposed to use CIT? And that aspect and approach just really didn't work well. It confused people. And what we've done and what the state's doing and best practices law enforcement wide are to include de-escalation training into all of your other trainings. So you take concepts of how can I best deal with this, whether it's increase the distance between myself and the person I'm dealing with, find a way to slow down time or give yourself more time to make better decisions, not go into a room where there's somebody if they're the only one in there in crisis. And we try to use that de-escalation training into all of our defensive tactics, all of our hands-on, all of our firearms training. We incorporate that in one form or another because the separation really isn't effective and it shouldn't be there. De-escalation should be a part of everything we're doing as police officers. That's been our approach, and it's been pretty effective for us so far.
And the last area I'll hit here. And last area I'll hit here is the accountability. So, fortunately we do get very few complaints, and I will say that all complaints are investigated. We do take them seriously. The results of those complaints, they can include coaching and counseling, verbal warning, written reprimand, suspension, or even termination. If we find gaps that we identify, we look to see if future training can help avoid the situation again in the future, and we give citizens a response back on all the complaints so they are made aware of the outcome of their complaints. And again, we're fortunate to receive very few complaints. So we work really hard to try to find resolution and get to the bottom of it, find out what happened. And then, like I say, take appropriate action and let the parties who complained in the first place, let them know the outcome. And even more rare or less frequent would be our use of force incidents. So very, very rarely do we have to use of force. I think when I looked back over the last 6 years, my initial look, and I think in the agenda bill, it says we apply force on average once every other year. I think I found 4 in the last 6 years of actual physical hands-on. Is relatively minor, but it was 4, so less than 1 a year. If we count pointing of a firearm, then maybe we average 1 a year total, all types of use of force. So physical force and pointing the firearm to gain compliance, we probably average about 1 of those a year. So very low use of force. As Sergeant Seifert mentioned, all use of force applications are reviewed all the way up the chain. I review those every year. At the end of the year, I get a summary. I review the summary. I look for any sort of pattern. So that is something that we take very, very seriously. Corrective actions are taken when necessary or when warranted. And also, if there's going to be for example, an officer-involved shooting, there's a separate criminal investigation that takes place by an outside team, so not Mercer Island. So an outside team would do that investigation, and then there's a separate administrative investigation to see if any policies were violated. So again, on accountability, we really do understand that the public, you all put your trust in your police department. You have high expectations, and rightly so. And we do take our performance seriously. I sincerely appreciate the fact that I probably get 20, no exaggeration, probably 20 to 1 on compliments and thank yous versus complaints. So I very much appreciate that. I appreciate when people take the time to express their gratitude. It is, it's a really difficult job. It's unlike any other job. And, at the beginning of the meeting, you heard Councilmember Rosenbaum acknowledge the fact that sometimes it's very dangerous and to include even deadly. So we're blessed to serve this community. Very fortunate that we get to work in an environment where the community itself also shares the same ideals that we do around equity, inclusion, trust with each other. It's a really wonderful community, and I'm pleased to have been here for the last 26 years with 14, the last 14 as your chief. The next slide here is just a generic question, conclusion. I think I already hit most of this here. And again, we just appreciate that support we have from our community. After this question slide, I know the mayor and I have been talking about the Obama pledge. So let me field a few questions here now. And then if we want to talk the next couple of slides, the mayor and I will walk through the Obama pledge. So I'm happy to entertain any questions people may have on the presentation with Mike or me here to answer.
Hi, Chief. Would you go ahead and stop sharing your screen, please? Thank you.
We do have some, first of all, I want to thank the chief and also Sergeant Seifert for the presentation. We do have some questions, and so Councilmember Rosenbaum and then Councilmember Reynolds.
Thank you. Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Sergeant. A question I have is around social media policies. Do we monitor officers' social media? I'm just kind of curious, sort of, given what's been going on, any answers you might have there?
I don't actively monitor them. If there are issues that pop up, I'm quite confident it wouldn't be long before I hear about it. But that's not something I go actively try to hunt through any social media. There are so many different platforms now. It's very difficult to keep up with, and I have 2 teenage sons, and I mean, it's just amazing how many different ways they have to communicate. But the short answer is no, we don't go actively mine through social media accounts. The longer answer is, like I say, if there were to be some issues, I'm sure I'd hear about it pretty quickly. Our background investigations, we do look at that very carefully. We've had some very interesting things pop up in the background investigations that have given me great pause, and actually I've passed on candidates due in part to the stuff that pops up on their social media accounts.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Reynolds, I had your hand up, but it's now down, so I'm going to go Councilmember Jacobson.
Chief, I'd like to just thank you and your team for the tremendous job they do and your commitment to unbiased policing and to serving the citizens of Mercer Island in such a magnificent way. And we've been blessed that we haven't had to deal with some of the kinds of things that Seattle and Bellevue has had to do. But my only question would be, what is it we can do as a city council to enhance what the police department is all about?
Well, I sincerely appreciate that question. And I guess I would say you can be, I was going to say advocate, but you can share with the community when they ask questions about your police department. You know, I am as transparent as possible with all of you, and you can certainly share with the citizens the things that you've heard directly from me, directly from Sergeant Seifert, your experience. I mean, I know each of you personally, some better than others, but I know each of you. And also, I would say this, council member, I'd say if you hear anything, if you hear concerns, and you've done this before, if you hear concerns from citizens or they're upset or concerned about something, I'll tell you what's not helpful. It's not helpful for me to hear from citizens, hey, you police always do X. It is helpful for me if I hear, hey, specifically, Chief, my neighbor, my friend, I heard last night from this person that they had this kind of an encounter with your officer. In those situations, I can follow up on it. If it's just sort of a general broad, hey, you guys always do X, it's difficult to respond. I am very happy to respond to specific concerns I hear. And so I guess, Councilmember Jacobson, to answer your question, one of the things you can do is if you hear things out there that cause you some pause or concern, please let me know about it. Give my number to whoever, or you can, if they want to go through you. But I do want to know about things when they happen so we can get to the bottom of it. And there's maybe some learning on our part that we can do. And perhaps there's some learning on the citizens' part and maybe understanding, okay, maybe I don't like it, but at least I understand why the police did what they did. So that would be very helpful. When you hear it, please let me know.
Thank you. Councilmember Reynolds?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, gentlemen. Very, very good presentation. Chief, I found the use of force report very interesting. I think you shared it with me originally a few weeks ago when I asked about it, and I was encouraged by what I read. To what extent is that document ever made public? And similarly, to the extent that you have a complaint log, which sounds like you do, is that made public? And if not, could it be on an appropriately anonymized basis, be something that's shared with the community?
Yeah, both could be made public. And we talked about this use of force report that all of you received. And it was one of those things, to be quite honest with you, I never perceived there to be an interest. The council never had asked about that before. I'm certainly happy to push that out to the council at the end of every year, just so you have some awareness around use of force. And there may be, you know, a blank piece of paper some years. Well, it wouldn't be blank, but I mean, there may not be anything on it. But usually there will typically, as if we go by averages, be one incident that we would highlight, that we could certainly push that out to the council every year. But I just had never had the request and never really thought there was an interest in that. But to your point, that is something we can do, sure.
And what did you say about the complaint log? I missed that. Is that something that could be posted as well?
Yes.
And to be clear, I'd love to see it, and members of the community would value seeing it, not just going to the council, but posted on the MI webpage.
Write that down.
Now, maybe that's a policy decision we need to make at the council, but I'd like to take it under advisement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Weicker?
So Chief Sergeant, I just want to thank you for your work, and I know you've been doing it for years, and I think your original moment of vulnerability and honesty about asking how we can do better really started a trend years ago. And I remember when some mosques were being bombed several years ago, you were working with other chiefs in the region. So I just want to give you a moment to brag or give us an update on how you're not alone in this work, and there are other chiefs in the area trying to do the same thing around implicit bias and cultural training and community policing. And this has been going on for a long time, not just in the last few months. So do you want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing lately? Because I know you've been doing this work for at least 6 or 7 years. I've had the pleasure to know you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So this is something that a number of years ago, it really weighed heavily on my heart. And so I tried to start up I did start up a public trust committee at our state, first it was at the local, the King County Police Chiefs Association. So I proposed the idea we start a public trust committee. This is probably back in 2011-ish. No, probably 2012, maybe 2013. And at first there wasn't a whole lot of interest. The Michael Brown shooting happened. There was suddenly a whole lot of interest. So we started up that public trust committee at the King County Police Chiefs Association. We brought in community members. It was over the course of probably a year. We met a number of times at the Renton City Hall, as Renton's police chief co-chaired that with me. So we met, we came up with what we call the menu of options. They were specific ideas that police chiefs or the sheriffs could employ in their communities to build meaningful relationships and bridges with their communities, and particularly their communities of color. So we did that here in King County. And then about a year later, our State Chiefs and Sheriffs Association decided to stand up their own public trust committee. So I was one of the co-chairs of that committee as well. And I basically took the work we had done in King County and I brought it to the statewide committee. I said, hey, here's what we've done. So in one of the 39 counties, this is what has worked pretty well for us. So the idea, Councilmember Weicker, was to, I guess, evangelize that across the state. And we said, there's no reason why Washington State can't be a model for the rest of the states and how to do this kind of meaningful work in a way that makes a difference. So I co-chaired that committee for a number of years. Now, Pierce County Sheriff and Bellevue's Police Chief are now co-chairing that. It was time for some different perspectives and different perspectives. So we've done that work. I've been very involved with all kinds of committees and work. I've often said, every police chief, every sheriff has his or her, number one or two passion that in their professional field. And, this truly does happen to be one of my areas of passion. I just have a strong conviction in the area of people feeling as though they've been treated equitably and fairly. And I know we're not perfect, and I know we don't always hit that mark, but I tell you, we do our level best. We really do. And I, as your police chief, am 100% committed to doing this type of work in a way that makes a difference. So we continue to do that. I'm currently working on the planning committee portion of the Sound Cities work. Councilmember Weicker, I saw you at the meeting last Friday afternoon. So this is something I am very happy to be involved with because I bring a whole lot of passion to it. It just means a lot to me. So.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Neese.
Chief, Sergeant, thanks for delivering the package of information. I was very interested in it, and I appreciate the in-depth that you went into. I wanted to ask a bit about how do the officers treat calls where they are responding to a citizen complaint of a suspicious activity or suspicion, and then in turn that creates an encounter that is perceived by the person that is perceived as suspicious as being biased. Is there more that needs to be done in the community to try and understand what is truly suspicious, what to report, and then how are we perceiving and logging and supporting officers that are involved in those types of situations when the genesis of it was a call?
Well, one of the things that we've started doing is asking the question, what is suspicious about this call? So if we get a call, hey, there's a suspicious male walking down the street. Okay, what makes him or her, depending on the case, what makes him suspicious? So we ask for specific actions that the person is doing versus, well, they appear homeless. They're a black man walking down the street. There's something like that. We have received those calls, and we are not going on those calls if all that's, quote, suspicious with this person is they don't appear to be from Mercer Island or whatever it is, whatever descriptor you want to use, or a person of color walking down the street. We will not respond to those. That's something actually our dispatch center is trained to ask for. So they will ask what is suspicious about this person. If the call comes to us, we will ask what is suspicious about this person. I've had officers tell me, they just say, I refuse to go to that call. I am not going, I'll get written up if needs be. I am not going on a call when there's nothing suspicious other than the color of that person's skin. So we are not doing that. We still do get those calls, not frequently, but we get them from time to time. So your question is a very good question, Councilmember Neese, and that is something that we are super tuned into. And there better be something described as what is making this person suspicious versus just they appear, their appearance. So that's our approach on that.
No, I appreciate that response. Is there anything that communities are doing to communicate around that when the community needs help identifying what is really an emergency response and what is something that doesn't need follow-up?
Yeah, I know we spend time in our, well, we used to have in-person block watches. Now we do virtual block watches, but we talk to neighborhoods about that. What are some things you can keep your eye out for? What makes something or someone suspicious? Because as police officers, like I just got done explaining, we need to hear something. We need to know what is it about this person that is suspicious before we even want to respond to that situation. So we try through block watches. We have that program, Pause on Patrol. It's a different variation of being our eyes and ears. Here's some things you can look out for when you're on a walk with your dog. You know, like I've said a number of times, we typically have only 3 officers. I think we averaged last time 3.4. So just a little over 3 officers on duty at any one time. In a community the size of Mercer Island, that's not very many officers. So we do rely on citizens being our eyes and ears. And again, just letting us know what is it about the person? What are they doing? What is it about their behavior that causes you some concern? And if it's, say, they're, you know, peeking in car windows, trying door handles, of course we'll come out and respond. So just things that don't look right, you know, at a minimum, you can always grab a license plate if the person's driving a car and just hang on to that. You could always call and pass it on to us. And hey, if something bad happened in the neighborhood, we'd at least have the license plate of that person. So there are little things you can do. But again, if it's just somebody who appears different than you, unless they're doing something, don't call us if they're not doing anything suspicious.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up, Chief, with Councilmember Neese's question. I think I'm just curious, you know, honestly, I suspect you guys keep a log as far as your encounters with the public. So I'm just wondering, do you keep it in terms of the person's race? I'm just thinking whether or not, because, you know, rightly or wrongly, Mercer Island in the past was certainly identified as a police force that engaged in racial profiling. And I know that in my experience, I haven't had that. I've heard that from other people. So I'm just curious whether or not you guys keep data on that. And if so, then it'd be interesting to see over the years if there's any kind of trend to dispel that kind of myth, or that basically, you know, indicates that maybe there is an issue.
Okay, Mayor, I'm not entirely sure if I'm clear on what you're asking. If we don't respond to a call, we're not going to have a statistic on that. We keep like CAD notes, so if we respond, but maybe we don't take a full police report, but we type up notes. Years ago, when I was on patrol, before we had in-car computers, I would handwrite on a little spiral notebook. Hey, I got dispatched at this time. I contacted this person named whatever, David, pick a name. And this is what happened. I write a sentence or two in a little log book, but I didn't like generate a police report for that. So now the officers will take little notes in the computer system. So I could query that. I'm just not entirely sure if I understand what you're looking at or looking for. Sorry.
Well, I guess, you know, maybe just put it bluntly, I guess, you know, there's always this concern about driving while black. And the question might be, are people of color stopped more frequently, you know, for whatever reason? And if so, then do you guys keep a log of some sort that would indicate to the public or show to the public that, no, that's not happening, or there may be, you know, a trend of some sort?
Yeah, we keep track of if we write citations or obviously if we make arrests. And Mayor, the technology that they have in the cars now, if they stop somebody but no ticket is issued, I would think there's probably a way to capture that. I honestly don't know how that technology works right now as far as if someone's given a warning. But as I mentioned earlier, I think when Councilmember Neese had asked a question, or maybe it was Councilmember Jacobson, yeah, it was, when you said, what can you as council members do? Please let us know if there's a concern, or to the citizens watching this, if you feel you've been treated unfairly by the police for whatever reason, rather than hang on to that, and then a year later, it happens again, and a year later happens again, and pretty soon you're seeing us through a certain lens. Just the first time that happens, if it happens, just please let us know, because I think you are owed an explanation as to what happened there. And again, I can't always maybe make you happy that you got a ticket or arrested, but you should at a minimum feel like you've been treated fairly. Maybe even if you had a warrant for your arrest and you were arrested, through that process, you should still be afforded dignity and respect. And if you're of the belief that that wasn't the case, I really do want to know about it. If I don't hear about it, then I can't address it, and I can't talk to the officer. We can't look into the situation. But Mayor, we're a small enough department that, and we talk, so people do know what's going on. And if there are issues, it's hard to hide in this department. It isn't as though we're a huge department where you can hide in different sectors, different parts of the city, work for totally different beats. So we're small enough, we know each other, and when issues pop up, we like to address them right away before they become bigger issues.
Great, thank you very much. Councilmember Neese.
So to the mayor's question about profiling, effectively profiling, would a tool like ALPR be to a benefit to the department and to the officers in terms of being able to patrol and have more confidence that there's not any particular profiling going on, but rather just crime fighting? Can you speak maybe to whether that is, a benefit or how that would be perceived in these times?
Sure. An ALPR hit takes, you could argue that a hit, and when I say hit, and you'll hear about this more next week, but a hit would be, let's just say, for example, you're driving a stolen car. The ALPR, this automatic license plate reader camera, would recognize that license plate and signal the officer. So you could argue it takes subjectivity out of that mix. So rather than say, hey, the officer, focused on that car, or why did the officer focus on that car and then stop that person? If the ALPR were to notify the officer, hey, that's a stolen car, it takes away the subjectivity. I mean, it pinged. I mean, it made the chime, whatever noise it makes, because that license plate was associated with a stolen vehicle. So I think to at least some extent, it gets to what you're speaking about, again, because it takes away any subjectivity on the officer's part. It just either chimes because it's a stolen car or not.
Great, thank you.
Great. We have Deputy Mayor Weicker.
Yeah, Chief, just to kind of wrap it up, I'm wondering what you're thinking about this ongoing COVID crisis, and if there's any special consideration or training or planning you're doing to think about what may or may not be coming our way in the next 6 months to a year, depending on how long this is going to last.
Yeah, that's the big question on, I think, most people's minds right now. And as I think you're all aware, so our emergency management program lives inside the police department. So Jennifer Franklin is one of our police officers and crime prevention officer. So that is something we talk about frequently. It's something we talk about frequently with our city manager and our call center. We have a call center that's staffed. So we speak about that, and specifically when it comes to the thrift store. I know we're going to be talking about that again coming up here, but that's closed right now because of COVID and the impacts to YFS. As I think, again, you all know, I'm the interim director for YFS right now as well. So this COVID pandemic impacts every department, at least to one extent or another. And, we're very mindful of that when we make contacts. I know the fire department is too, because we go into people's homes, into care facilities, into places where people might have that virus. So we do, again, you've heard it before, we have our personal protective equipment, and it's something we go through, sort of a mental exercise before we make contact with somebody. And to the extent we can all continue to do what we need to do, socially distance, please wear your masks, especially, when you're out in public interacting with people. There are steps we can take to slow this down because we've done it before. And then I think, if things got relaxed or people were too close to each other, too many interactions. So I think, again, a really sobering reminder, look at the numbers and let's just do our part and what we can to keep everybody healthy.
Great. Thank you. As you know, I've received multiple requests recently to sign the President Obama's mayor's pledge to address police use of force policies. And while you and I have discussed this pledge and think that the sentiment of the pledge is important, I'm personally not quite sure if it really is appropriate for Mercer Island, and so I'd just like to have your feedback, your response.
Chief, you're muted.
Chief, you're on mute. Okay, there you go.
Okay, how about that? Let me see if I can get this computer to advance to the next slide. Okay, okay, so I mentioned this earlier. So the mayor and I have been in contact, in communication with each other over what he has received requests to do, to sign on the mayor's commitment to action. It talks about these 4 areas. So review use of force policies, engage the communities, get some input, report back, and then reform the use of force policy itself. So here's, I guess, our response, or my response to the mayor, and I'm sharing it now with everybody. We have reviewed our use of force policy, and we actually made some revisions that probably would not have happened had we not had these conversations, and I'm speaking to the mayor and I. So quickly, the verbal warning. Up until we made this recent change, the verbal warning really, technically, it only lived in one part of our use of force policy. So it didn't actually technically say you need to issue a verbal warning, when feasible, prior to all or any application of deadly force. But now it does. So we changed that. The other thing we changed in our use of force policy was specifically calling out the fact that if you point your firearm at somebody, that is considered a use of force and you'll need to write a report on that. So I know those aren't like earth-shattering, huge changes, but they are changes. And I think I'm trying to demonstrate to the community that although I think our policies are really solid, I'm not suggesting they're perfect. And so to the extent we need to make some adjustments and changes, we'll do that. That the second bullet on the slide, it says, the 4th action point is to reform policies. And it really does assume, I think, that a city or a police department has policies that don't include best practices. Sergeant Seifert talked about a 3rd bullet point. We contract with that company, Lexipol. And, I'll say this, when I first became chief, so 14 some years ago, the one phone call I made to the chief who hired me, who was here for 29 years, the one call I made, and I tried not to bug him, but I thought this is one I need some help on. I called him and I said, it was Jan Devaney. I said, there's this company called Lexipol. What do you think? They write policies. They have a team of attorneys looking at case law, any changes to state law, any changes to case law. What do you think? And he said, Ed, he says, that's one thing that I always worried about was our policies, because as soon as the ink dries on a policy, inevitably there's a change in case law, and it's very, very hard to stay up with all the changes. So given that feedback, I went ahead and felt comfortable moving forward with Lexipol. And I think I've mentioned to you before, founded by one of our former mayor's brothers, so Alan Merkel's brother is one of the founders of the company. And we've been very pleased because it comports with state law, federal law. They have the daily training bulletins. And then the last bullet here on your screen, it really is designed, I think, that pledge for departments that don't include best practices. I mean, we haven't allowed neck restraints. We don't train on that. That's not even something we train on. That's not something we do. We do require officers to intervene if they see another officer applying excessive force. We have a verbal warning, as I mentioned, before application of any deadly force. And we have to do reporting, thorough reporting. So MIPD's, Mercer Island Police Department's policy includes all of these. And so, you know, this last slide here, sort of the response to the pledge. So the pledge is a commitment to action. And in our form of government, you know, the whole city council has to sign on to that pledge. But I guess two considerations. You know, our use of force policy, it already includes the best practices. It comports with current law. And at the June 16 meeting, you know, you talked about doing a much broader engagement process with the community. So rather than have it narrowly focused on police or use of force, and I already explained we have very few incidents of use of force, at least my offering of words of, I guess, advice, maybe consider just wrapping the use of force or the police part of the discussion into a much broader discussion. We've said a number of times that issues surrounding racism and or inequities, they're not just confined to the criminal justice system. I mean, we hear concerns in all areas of life. So I think if we as a city want to take a bold step forward, we do it in a more broad context rather than like I say, a real refined context. So those are my comments there. I'll go back to stop sharing my screen. That's my, I guess, input on the mayor's pledge. I think it's probably really appropriate for some communities that are way behind. I used to do assessments of police departments. I was on a team. I co-chaired a team. We would do assessments of other police departments at their request across the state. And some departments, I mean, they need a lot of help. At least they did when I was on this team. So, you know, I've always been proud of our department. I think while not perfect, we do a pretty darn good job. I realize I'm biased. I've been here a long time, but I'm also very aware of shortcomings in other departments in my work with the state and even at the national level in years past. I feel very confident that we have good, strong policies in place. We train on them. You know, Mike Seifert is our training sergeant, does an excellent job on these types of things. So I feel confident that we got a good thing going on here.
Thank you, Chief. Does anybody have any comments or questions regarding the Chief's comments about the Councilmember Reynolds?
Yeah. Chief, if I'm not mistaken, we have, is it true, is it one African-American police officer on the force?
Currently, yes.
And I understand that recruiting is a big challenge for police departments these days, and so you can't always pick and choose how you got. But looking online, I was saying that Seattle Police Department is about 9%, and I think the recent recruiting class I saw the story showed 39% were underrepresented groups. What are they doing differently that we could learn from to broaden our recruiting efforts to get more underrepresented groups on the force?
That is a great question. I was on a radio show, a talk show, I don't know, a number of years ago, and it was a Black-owned radio station. I was doing a program talking about policing and Mercer Island Police, and I was asked the question, how many Black police officers do you have working for you? And at that time, I think we had one or maybe two at that time. One of the comments I made, and I'll make it again tonight. So half of the equation is how do we recruit, do a better job recruiting. The other half is the people have to want to work here. So people of color need to want to work here. And I think oftentimes what I have heard is people will want to work in environments that where they feel comfortable or where the population mirrors who they are. And so this is something that we talk about a lot in police circles, at police chiefs meetings. How do we do a better job recruiting? How do we become more welcoming? You know, we have very clear policies, very clear training, as you heard about tonight. We use public safety testing. It's a former police chief who runs the company, does our recruiting, the testing for us, physical fitness and written test. He does his level best to do as broad of recruiting as he can. We have gone to job fairs. We've gone to testing sites to encourage people to test with Mercer Island. So I would love to have more diversity. I truly believe that diversity of perspective, diversity of input, diversity in many different shapes, forms, colors, I think all that makes any organization stronger. So I am all for and very supportive of ways to bring in diversity of perspective that you only get from living or walking in certain people's shoes, or being able to live a certain way brings you to the department with a perspective that you otherwise wouldn't have. So I very much appreciate the question, Councilmember Reynolds, and it's something we give a ton of time and thought to, and just we'll continue to, because I'd love to see more diversity. We've hired some women recently, and some people of color recently, and I think it just makes us a better department. So we'll keep working on those efforts.
Chief, I want to make sure the council understands as well, we're a small city. We don't have recruiters on staff or even on contract. So when Chief Holmes is saying we go to job fairs, what he means is he goes to job fairs or his leadership goes. I just want to be honest about the recruiting environment, particularly prior to the pandemic. It was very, very competitive and difficult for us to fill positions across the entire city. That included both police and fire. But we're resourced very differently from Seattle. Seattle has a giant human resources department and an active component of their public safety divisions dedicated to recruiting.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Chief, I have one question for you and then a question for the council. So the question to you is, I know that your training does not include neck restraints or whatever, and so that, which is great. But do you see a problem if the use of force policy expressly states that neck restraints, chokeholds are prohibited? I know that, again, you said that it's not part of your training, so I didn't see it expressly.
Your audio cut out on you, I'm sorry. Could you ask that one more time?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll just be very brief. So I know your training does not include neck restraints, but I did not see in the use of force policy an express prohibition against neck restraints and chokeholds. So I'm just curious whether or not it's possible to include those expressed prohibitions.
As I mentioned a little bit ago, I think we have really good policies. However, I'm not closed-minded to tweaks to improve. So I've talked to Mike Seifert about this prior to the meeting, because you called me about this, Mayor, and I thank you for that. So I would be comfortable adding language to our use of force policy saying, hey, a neck restraint would be considered deadly force if used. So I would certainly be comfortable saying that in a policy, that if you're doing the neck restraint thing, that would be in a deadly force type of a situation. So we could certainly add that as per our conversations we've had.
Okay, thank you. Before I ask the question of the council, Councilmember Reynolds, do you have another question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chief, you talked a little bit about your hiring process, and the Sergeant did as well. What can you tell me in the hiring process do you do specifically to screen for racist or biased attitudes or predilections?
I'm going to have Sergeant Seifert take that one.
A couple of things we do that is mostly dealt with during the investigation, where you're interviewing friends, you're interviewing family members, you're interviewing anybody this person has worked for, interviewing schoolmates, any contact this person has had. And I know the chief talked earlier about social media. We don't necessarily do deep diving into social media for current officers. But during that background investigation, there is a deep dive into social media. That is often where you get a very complete history of the person that's a candidate a new tool that we've been using. One of the products that public safety testing provides to us is let me get the wording right here. It's called an intercultural sensitivity measure analysis. And it's something that's provided that I guess the questions are integrated into the written test that the candidates take, and they provide us with an analysis of the candidate. And we don't use this prior to the background investigation. This is something that the background investigator can then take into an account and then use it as a play to create discussion or talk to people, whether it's the candidate themselves or somebody that's involved with the candidate's background investigation. And it rates the candidates on 3 categories, some big words here. So one of them is ethno-relativism, cultural minimization, and ethnocentrism. So those are the scores that are given. And as the analysis is provided through the testing service, they also provide an explanation of what is causing the scores that candidate is getting. So the background investigation is where most of the looking into whether somebody has a history of discrimination is going to be most effectively done.
Thank you, Greg.
Great, thank you. And so the question to the council is, in light of the thoughts and the comments from the chief about the mayor's pledge, and that our policies do not need to be reformed, and that we will be discussing how to engage the community in listening sessions in the future, does the council believe that there's a need for our community to sign this pledge? In essence, to direct me to sign this pledge. So I'm looking for comments, direction. I see Councilmember Anderall.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I had some technical difficulties, and so I had to switch from my iPad to my city phone, and it was pretty difficult to see all of the small print. I thought that there were other provisions in the pledge that were of concern, and maybe that's not the pledge, maybe it's it's one of the other documents that would require all alternatives to be explored before the use of force occurred, not just all reasonable alternatives. I don't know if that's in this or if that's in a different document, but so I'd like a clarification on that from the chief if he can do it. I think he knows what I'm talking about, even though I'm probably not being super clear. And then my thought is, I don't like to do meaningless or hollow acts. If our city comports with all of the requirements, then I think signing on to the pledge is just window dressing. I mean, let's admit that we're doing a lot of this right, and we don't need to take a pledge because we're not non-compliant with any of these things. I mean, the alternative argument I know is, well, if you're doing it all, then there's no harm in taking the pledge. But I just think this is honestly feels more political than substantive, and I would rather stick to doing substantive stuff.
Thank you. Please, Chief, you want to respond? The 8 Can't Wait, is that the other campaign?
Yeah, the 8 Can't Wait, and sometimes they're linked. I think they're separate initiatives, but they are linked. One of the 8 items in the 8 Can't Wait says that officers will exhaust all other means before applying deadly force. And while I certainly appreciate and understand what the thinking is behind that, I have concerns with saying that you'll exhaust all other means, because quite honestly, I mean, words mean something, and anybody who's spent some time in a courtroom knows that words mean something in policy. So if I say you have to exhaust all other means, and someone, for example, say someone kills someone on the street and they're running down the street with their gun, they're going to go kill somebody else. If I exhaust all other means, that means I just completely disengage and drive away. What we have right now, it has to be reasonable. So any application of force must be reasonable. And I think in the scenario I just described, it would be unreasonable to let somebody who's hell-bent on killing people run down the street and just to let them go. But if I said you must exhaust all other options is to just disengage and drive away. Because if I apply deadly force and it's, gee, Officer Holmes, isn't it true you could have done something different other than applying deadly force? And the answer is, well, I guess. I mean, yeah, I could have driven away. And so I want to be really careful. We're not setting up the officers for some bar that we put so high that it's almost impossible to ever reach. I get why they have that in there. I've been on the policy board of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We talked at length about this very thing when another police think tank came out with this notion of going above and beyond the Graham versus Connor. That's the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that addresses officer-involved applications of deadly force. And so I think we need to stay true to what the highest court in the land has stated is our bar, and to do something different than that, I think we wind up getting ourselves in trouble. And to Councilmember Andrews' other point, I think if you were to choose to sign something, there is an expectation that you do what it says, which is engage the community, reform your policies, make big changes is what's implied in that Obama pledge with the mayors. And I guess I would just again say, I think we meet almost all of their points, all the things they're looking for. We have a very contemporary policy, and you just heard me acknowledge to the mayor, I'm willing to even to make yet another change and specifically call out that application of any neck restraint would be considered a deadly force. So I think with that addition, we have more than covered what the primary interest is that people have in their police department's use of force policies.
Thank you, Chief. You know, I know Councilmember Reynolds and Councilmember Jacobson, you have your hands up, but I'm trying to see if we can bring this discussion to some sort of closure and, you know, perhaps to entertain a motion one way or the other to authorize the mayor to sign the pledge. Obviously, if no motion is made, I guess that issue is resolved. If a motion is made, then we can have further discussions. But
Mayor, if I could just chime in here, this is a study session.
I'm sorry. You're right. Sorry.
The item authorization to approve was going to be considered under next week's meeting agenda.
I apologize. Thank you for the reminder. It was getting a lot of good discussions, a lot of good questions and responses. Councilmember Reynolds.
Thank you. For what it's worth, I would look forward to the discussion at the next meeting on that topic. To Councilmember Andrews' point, I too am wary of hollow gestures, but I think this is probably not a hollow gesture to adopt something like this, because I think it sends an important message of commitment to the community, and I think that's important. I think it's an important thing to do. Secondly, I think while I recognize we don't want to commit to reform if we think there are no reforms to be made, I think it's probably a little bit naive to believe that there's nothing that can be done to make the you know, you guys are doing a great job from everything I can tell. I love what I hear, but there's always room for improvement. And I think acknowledging that is an important gesture and an important thing to do and to look at.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Jacobson.
I'd probably feel differently if I weren't persuaded by both my interaction with Chief Holmes and some of his officers, and in observing what I've observed on Mercer Island, and that, you know, I might be inclined to be in favor of gestures, whether they're hollow or not. But I don't see this one as contributing anything. I think one thing we should consider is how well we listen to this community. I think that's far more important in terms of the expectations of the citizens of this island, is listening to them. And if we need to have listening sessions in a gym someplace where people can social distance and get up the microphone and say what they have to say, and we listen to it, that's something we should be doing. I think that makes a whole hell of a lot more difference to people on the island of all stripes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Again, thank you. It was a very good study session. Thanks to the police chief and Sergeant Seifert. I think before we go to our second study session item, perhaps we should take a 10-minute break, or you might do a 5-minute break. I see
Whatever
5.
you give us, Mayor.
We're going to go 5. We're going to go 5 because we still have a long ways to go. So a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 7:46. Okay, thank you. See you, Chief.
All right, Mayor Wong, we are back live.
Okay, great. Okay. We now move to the second study session item, Agenda Bill 5726, the Mercer Island Fire Department Fire Services Study. Really, as a reminder to myself, there is no formal action required. We're here to receive the report and provide feedback to the staff on recommendations. So welcome Fire Chief Steve Heitman.
Good evening, Council. Steve Heitman, your Fire Chief. Tonight, we're here to present a study done by the Matrix Consulting Group that was developed so that to see if the city can realize greater efficiencies in the delivery of fire protection services. With us tonight is Robert Finn, who's a senior consultant from Matrix Consulting Group, and he's the former chief of South Lake, Texas. Robert, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chief. Mayor and Council, I appreciate the opportunity to present to you tonight. We've got a brief PowerPoint presentation that's going to give a high-level overview of the study, our findings, and the recommendations. Feel free to stop me anytime during the presentation or at the end with any questions or comments you have.
Okay.
So hopefully my screen is shared.
Yes, it is.
Okay. You never know. I can see it, but it doesn't mean you guys can. So again, I appreciate the time tonight. I'm Robert Finn, Senior Manager with Matrix Consulting Group. I've been working with them since June of 2011. Before that, as the Chief said, I spent 25 years with the City of South Lake in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We were a public safety department protecting a town of about 35,000 people. So the study objectives, the City commissioned a staffing study to look at the organization operational assessment of the fire department. That included gathering input from internal and external stakeholders. And if you had told me at the end of February the way things were going to transpire in the world up to this point, and finally getting to the council presentation via Zoom, I wouldn't have believed it, but it's definitely been a strange 5 months to get to this point. So as doing that, we looked at the existing conditions of the fire department, looked at the analysis of what their current needs are, as well as future service demands would be, looked at opportunities for future service delivery models, and then presenting the findings to the City Council. As part of the study, we received input from both elected and appointed officials in the city during face-to-face interviews. So those occurred just a couple of weeks before the Seattle area became one of the first hotspots, and ever since then, everything's been being handled remotely. The fire department gave extensive input through face-to-face interviews as well. They were instrumental in sending us data about the organization and answering questions regarding the data, providing follow-up data and information as we needed it. Then we did the current service delivery and sent that to them in the form of a profile of the existing conditions to make sure we had a factual basis for moving forward as we did deeper analysis, and then looked at the delivery of resource operations in the department, and then worked with the chief as we finalized the document on any findings, assumptions, analysis, areas where we needed additional data or edits to the report to get to tonight's presentation. So there's a number of key strengths of your fire department I think that are important to highlight. First is the Class 4 rating with the Washington Survey and Ratings Bureau. So nationally, there's an organization called the Insurance Services Organization that rates fire departments, and 1 being the best score and 10 being the lowest score you can get. So in Washington, they've got a state agency that does that. And it looks at a number of things from how the fire department is staffed, what type of apparatus they deploy, what the water supply available for firefighting is, the dispatch and communications center. So there's a number of things that go into the rating. In Washington State, again, a 1 would be the best score, and it could go up to 10 as the lowest score. But there's very few agencies that have achieved a score better than 3 in Washington State, and none have achieved a 1. So 4 is a very high rating. And in the next slide, we'll talk about the importance of that. The fire department has set and is meeting industry acceptable performance standards. So when you look at fire services, NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, their standard 1710 for urbanized areas with career departments sets standards. Typically, departments try to achieve their standards for call processing and turnout time, unless there's some station design issues or they just find that they can't meet turnout time standards. But the travel time standards are very difficult for departments to achieve because it's a one-size-fit-all 4-minute travel time standard. So the Center for Public Safety Excellence, which is the accrediting body for fire departments, says for your baseline performance, look at the past 3 years of data and report on how well you're doing and set your community standards based on that. And then the community can determine if that's acceptable. And Mercer Island set an 8-minute, 90% of the time travel time standard compared to the 4-minute one set by NFPA. When we did the mapping, there's a very effective overlap between the 2 stations for that 8-minute travel time. So if one station's on a call, the other station would be able to cover a good majority of the island in that 8-minute time. Also, the dispatch center is processing calls and dispatching the fire department under 1 minute 90% of the time, and that exceeds NFPA standards and exceeds the 1-minute standard that the Mercer Island Fire Department has set for dispatching calls 90% of the time. When we looked at where your stations are currently located, the station locations coincide with where the call density is the highest, so they're in good locations for an immediate response to where the majority of the calls are going. Unit hour utilization of your units is below 10%, which is good. When you start seeing unit utilization levels getting above 20%, then there's some difficulty in meeting response time capabilities because the units are tied up at such larger increments that then you're pulling resources from other areas of the island or from your automatic and mutual aid partners. And then the training and fire prevention programs in the department are well developed and are working well for the organization. So back to that Washington Surveying and Ratings Bureau, you can see that there are 80 agencies that have achieved the same score as you, which is a 4, 48 that are slightly better than you at a 3, and then only 5 that have achieved a 2 and none that have achieved a 1. So this is one of the tools that insurance agencies use to set your insurance rates. So they usually couple it with actual fire loss. So the lower your score on this, the lower your rating number, the lower the impact on homeowner and business rates. So anything you can do to go from a 4 to a 3 would be your next move. And when you look at the report that's generated by this organization, it basically rates you and shows you your score and areas you can improve. So it's a good tool to see what are some low cost, no cost, or operational things that we can do to potentially lower our score and move into that 3. When we looked at the response time performance, again, the call being answered in the dispatch center to a unit being told that there's an emergency, notified by the dispatch center, you can see that over the 5-year period, the average at 90th percentile was 50 seconds, so 10 seconds better than the baseline performance set by the department. And again, 10 minutes better than the benchmark NFPA standard of 1 minute as well. So the dispatch center is doing an excellent job of getting units notified and en route. And this is one of the controllable things when we're talking about response time, the call processing time, and then the next is turnout time. How quickly do the firefighters get to the vehicle and begin to travel to the emergency? And then the travel time, which is less controllable because distance from the station to the call, traffic conditions, weather conditions will all impact that. So it's less controllable. And the only way to really improve that is to build more stations, hire more people, and purchase more apparatus, which is very expensive for what may be minimal gains to your performance. So when we looked at the turnout time, the department set daytime and nighttime objectives. Again, NFPA's 1 minute for EMS calls, 1:20 for fire calls, and they don't separate daytime and nighttime. It is a practice of many departments to separate these in their organizations. So the Mercer Island Fire Department has set 1:30 for medical calls in the daytime, 2 minutes for medical calls at night, 2 minutes for fire calls in the daytime, and 2 minutes and 30 seconds for fire calls at night. And you can see for the 5-year average, they pretty much met those except for medical calls at night, which was 11 seconds longer than their performance goal. But overall, when you're looking at these types of performance, you know, they're definitely within alignment to what they're trying to achieve. Opportunities to improve it really just is measuring it, reporting it in the stations, and letting the personnel know how they're doing so that they can see their performance and can maybe get a little more spring in their step to get to the units. When it came to travel time, again, you've got the 8-minute travel time objective, but you're really exceeding that by a fair number. You can see the 5-year average at the 90th percentile was 5 minutes and 47 seconds for medical calls and 6 minutes and 34 seconds for fire calls. So there may be an opportunity when you look at the previous 3 years of data when they update their standard of cover document to lower that performance objective, since it's clear that you're doing far better than the 8-minute performance objective that they've adopted. So some improvement opportunities that we saw, one was with training, using an online training program for the didactic portion, so you didn't have to have as much overtime for the training officers, as well as doing video conferencing between the stations to allow the personnel to stay in their station for classroom type training, so it could be delivered via video conferencing and units remain in their district to ensure that you're able to keep your response times as quick as possible. There may be a need for additional personnel as high-rise and mid-rise development continues in that downtown quarter. So that's something you're going to have to keep an eye on to make sure that the development trends in the community don't drive the need for additional personnel. Because as you go vertical, there's a need for more firefighters to arrive on scene quickly than when you don't have those types of developments. You've also got a D shift firefighter that works various days of the week to cover for the Kelly shifts. So moving that person to a dedicated 24-hour shift and hiring 2 more will reduce your annual overtime costs. And so the cost of the firefighters is about $225,000 a year with benefits, but your overtime savings is close to $390,000. So you're looking at well over $100,000 in annual savings by bringing those additional positions, and it would reduce the amount of overtime that personnel would have to work and improve their work-life balance. And then later replacing an engine with a Quint, which is it's an engine, but it has an aerial component on top of it, usually 75 feet, which would improve your ability to get an aerial apparatus on scene in one area where the rating bureau really scored you lower than you would like to see was in the availability of A, an aerial apparatus, and B, a reserve aerial apparatus. So with your agreement with Bellevue, that would give you the reserve aerial apparatus if yours was down. So you'd have points for that, as well as their continued ability to bring a larger ladder on scene if needed. But you'd have the ability in your area where you're starting to go vertical, and the ladder's needed to get one. But we wouldn't recommend doing that until you're going to replace an engine that's due for replacement. When the Rating Bureau starts to see that you need an aerial apparatus is anytime 3 or more structures over 35 feet are constructed. So again, as buildings get taller, then that's when it drives that need to start to consider that type of apparatus. So
I have a question, if this is okay, from Councilmember Anderall.
Thank you. I was just on the prior slide, the hiring 2 additional firefighters and reducing overtime. I understand that you said that would improve the work-life balance for the existing firefighters, but I hear through other sources that they don't want their overtime reduced. The part of the incentive to work for the department is the amount of overtime that's available. Do you have any thoughts or insights on that issue?
So as we met with personnel, there was not any issues expressed of excessive overtime being required. It's just as we did the analysis, we found that if you kept your minimum staffing at 7, but increased each shift by 1 person, it would save you a net of about $162,000 a year when you look at the overtime savings compared to what those salary costs are going to be. But it would also reduce the amount of overtime needed. One thing we did hear is that in the last couple of years, there was more Family Medical Leave Act use. There was increases in sick time usage, increases in workman's compensation leave. So those things coupled together kind of drove that rise in overtime costs.
Chief, can I ask just a follow-up question, and you may be the appropriate person to respond to. I know 2019 was an extraordinary year for overtime, and we had a number of things happen at the same time. We had, I think, 2 babies. So we had leave for the birth of a child. We had a military leave. We had a jury duty leave. And I think we had another medical all happening at once. And I do recall a conversation about, certainly everyone's willing to take one for the team. But it did strain our staff for a period of time with all that. Am I recalling that correctly? Can you just follow up to Councilmember Anderall's question, please?
That is correct. We did. Yes, last year, 2019 was an unprecedented year just because we actually had 2.5 full FMLA usages. 1 carried over because the last 6 weeks in 18 then carried over into the first 6 weeks of 19 because they get 12 weeks off for that. We had an unprecedented military leave, which we had never had before. And then we also, on top of all of that, had an opening for a firefighter who retired in February, and we did not get his replacement on board and through the academy until this year. And so we had over a year with a vacancy on a shift as well.
So, and just to get back to my question, I do recall a conversation, of course, I was transitioning in about mid-year as the interim city manager, that the crews were getting a little burned out on overtime. I just wanted to confirm my recollection of what was happening in 19.
Yes, because we had so many holes, it was getting to the point where we had to order people in upon occasion or say, hey, yes, we know you're getting off shift, but guess what? You're staying with us another 24 hours because we need somebody to fill this shift. And that didn't happen often. But yes, we did have, for the first time that I had heard people saying, wow, I can't believe how much overtime there is.
All right, I just wanted to clarify because 2019 was different than our prior years. Thank you.
And so basically what happens now is with your current staffing and scheduling, one person is off on a Kelly day, one person uses their regular vacation leave, and then if there's any unplanned leave, sick time or any other type of leave, then you're having to call in overtime to backfill a position. So what this recommendation does is it allows you to have one person for one unplanned leave event or a long-term leave event going on, and then you wouldn't need overtime until the second unplanned leave occurred.
No other questions right now, Robert, so go ahead.
Yeah, so really continuing their best practice of monitoring their response time metrics against their established community standards, and then adjusting those as needed to ensure that they're meeting the community expectations for performance and response times. They currently use 2 shift personnel to manage and deliver the training programs. That's working well for the agencies. They have a set number of overtime hours that they're scheduled to work to deliver those training programs. So continuing that, because there's really not the need in the department your size to hire a full-time training officer to work 40 hours a week to deliver training. Again, investing in the online training program to deliver the didactic portions. That allows more flexibility. So if somebody's off, when they come in their next shift, they log on, they take the online training, they take the test, and that didactic classroom type portion is the same for all personnel. And then those training officers can focus more on the hands-on evolution type training, and which is something that would also improve your rating by getting more multi-company and single company evolution type drills going throughout the year, because those are important. They score them for daytime, nighttime, single company, multi-company, a variety of things. Using the video conference between the stations to allow units to remain in their district and ensure that they can respond to calls timely instead of having to respond out of district. If your second station is at your headquarters doing a training class, then and the call's right next to their station, it delays that response time. And then again, assigning that D shift firefighter to a shift, and then hiring 2 additional firefighters, which give you that net savings of $162,000 when compared to the current cost of overtime versus the cost of those positions. So as part of hiring those, again, you would want to continue the 7-person minimum daily shift staffing and the scheduling of a Kelly day and a vacation leave on each shift. But you would have the buffer. One mistake a lot of agencies make is they bring the next person on, all of a sudden minimum staffing goes up to 8 and you haven't fixed anything in terms of overtime. You put yourself right back into the same situation you were in. And the final thing that we were asked to look at was the potential for contracting with another agency to provide services. So we met with Eastside Fire Rescue, we met with City of Bellevue Fire Department, as well as Seattle, and each one of those gave us, the chief had some estimates, and then Bellevue also provided us an estimate. And we looked at the pros and cons of each one of those. Seattle was more expensive than your current way of providing services, mostly related to their contractual requirement with firefighters to have 4-person minimum staffing on all apparatus. So that extra personnel really drove your costs. And culturally, they're probably not the best fit for a smaller town, close-knit type community that Mercer Island enjoys. Eastside Fire Rescue, they gave 3 options. Culturally, they'd probably be a real good fit. The biggest issue there is, I mean, you're really hiring them to staff your stations. The staffing's not going to change. The service levels aren't going to change. So you're really just getting some administrative consolidation, but all that administration is quite some distance away from the city. So you really lose the benefit of having the chief and the deputy.
Rob, I'm going to interrupt. I know you're not ready to finish up on the issue about contracting with other cities, but we have Councilmember Neese has a question.
I wanted to touch on both your points. So you've mentioned that the addition of the additional D shift firefighters would save a net of 162, but you're bringing them in at base salary levels, which they're not going to stay at forever. So did you look at kind of the diminishing return of the ROI on the addition of the D shift? Because what you're effectively doing is paying entry-level firefighters to do the work of more senior firefighters that are also getting paid overtime. That is not going to be an enduring solution to the problem. It's going to be a Band-Aid for some period of time.
Yeah, the thing where that helps is during the normal course of turnover in the organization. You're fortunate your fire department has very low turnover, but you'll have people retire and you'll be hiring new people at that lower rate. We can look at that and add that to the report if that's something you'd like to see before the report goes.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that. So when you consider Eastside Fire and you're kind of characterizing it as a staffing agency type model for Mercer Island's equipment and fire stations, you would have a broader pool of firefighters that you'd be pulling from. So if you have FMLA or if you have a jury duty, if you have a military call out, the larger pool that you have there, wouldn't it present less overtime and have a greater pool of resources? Whereas when you try and do that consolidation on a small scale, a 30-person department, the ROI can get you or not.
Yeah, so it's going to depend on how that contract is worked. And same thing with Bellevue, we got a larger organization with a deeper pool of personnel, but it depends on how you're staffing. So some staffing models, when we look at the contracts that are done, it's a constant level staffing, and the overtime issues are the burden of the contracting agency. Others, they actually charge the cities for the overtime as it occurs. So it would really depend on how that final contract is worded, if it would save you any overtime, or if they're saying we're staffing with X, and anytime we have to bring someone else over in an overtime capacity, then we bill the city for that overtime.
Yeah, and so maybe you can speak to the process that you went through to fully vet those types of situations, because here we are, a council, looking at the pros and cons of discussions with 3 partner agencies. But if that wasn't contemplated, then that's either in the pro or the con column. But I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, and their proposals were very brief and just really provided startup costs and annual estimations for costs, and didn't really go into how each one of those provisions would be handled.
So your recommendation, if the council was interested in pursuing partner agency type agreements, would be to fully vet that out in some sort of rigorous process?
Yeah, you'd really want to get to the full nuts and bolts of each one of the cost drivers, overtime being a critical one, because that can change the cost of the contract considerably.
And then to your point about COVID-19, did that not come into this discussion as we look at a pandemic and as we look at some of the surrounding firehouses that have had COVID-19 positive cases? Whole firehouses have been taken out of service. Would that not be in the pro column? Once you have a partner agency that has more firehouses, that you have a little bit more durability in the system?
Well, anytime you can get some depth to your system, that's definitely a benefit, is that you got the depth of more resources. But,
I guess I was surprised not to see that in there. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Reynolds.
Just a question about the East Side Fire and Rescue, and I imagine the same question would apply to Bellevue. What is their mode of operation typically for staffing? So if we were to contract out to them, would we have Mercer Island firefighters that are the same people all the time, or would they work in Mercer Island one week and Bellevue the next week and Redmond the week after that?
Typically what you see is that there's an annual bid for what station you would work at. So Mercer Island would become part of their system. Each one of those agencies indicated that they would retain all the current Mercer Island operations personnel. So your firefighters would, in a sense, become employees of either Eastside Fire District or Bellevue, but they may say, you know, I don't want to work this quiet station anymore. I want to go somewhere with a little more action and try to bid a Bellevue station. And maybe an older, more experienced person in Bellevue says, you know, I'm done with all these 20 calls a shift. I want to go somewhere a little quieter, and may bid your second station because they're looking for somewhere quieter. So typically you'd see an annual bid, and then you'd have those same people working at the same station on their assigned shift.
And typically would the cost be allocated on a headcount basis, or if all the old expensive guys and expensive women want to come here, do we get the high cost?
That's something you have to be careful of in the contract. So it is one thing that we saw in overtime or study for Pacific Grove, and they contracted with the city of Monterey. And that's how that billing occurred, is it was based on who bid the station, and the older, more expensive folks were bidding Pacific Grove station because it was quieter.
And presumably in drafting a contract like that, we could specify some service level agreements about number of staff on site, levels of equipment here, et cetera. That would be negotiated in advance typically.
Yep. Yeah, that would all be part of the contract, is how you'd be staffed.
And you mentioned savings in administration. What specifically would happen? Would we be losing a chief and a deputy chief, or one or the other, or both, or something else?
So they all expressed an interest in Bellevue specifically. The battalion chiefs were the biggest interest to them because they've got a gap in their battalion chief coverage. So your battalion chiefs would fill that gap nicely to be able to cover the island and the area where they see the gap in service. They thought prevention would be absorbed into their organization. The chief is kind of an unknown, so there weren't any guarantees with anybody on administration, except that Eastside Fire Rescue in their document did say they believe there would be a position for the chief, but it wasn't guaranteed.
Maybe just to follow up on that question, Councilmember Reynolds, it's unlikely in a contract model that we would retain any of the staff working on our payroll. What our contract agencies do and rehiring would all be part of that conversation. So although we wouldn't employ a chief, I just want to remind you, under any contract scenario, we're still paying for a proportionate share of the administration of that relationship, whatever that looks like.
Understood. Thank you.
So I have a few questions, but remember, this is our first touch of this report, and council members are encouraged to give Robert suggestions in terms of revising the report. And I heard Councilmember Anise raise a couple of quick questions, and I'm assuming, Robert, you're taking notes, and when coming up with more arguments or more deeper analysis of the contracting alternatives, it'd be something that should be included.
Mayor, can I just jump in there? I want to do some expectation setting here. This initial contract with Matrix Consulting did not include a comprehensive analysis of a contracting relationship with another party. If the council desires us to take that step, we can do that. That will be additional funding, and we would need to determine who did that work. This was a high-level study looking at operations, so I just want to make sure we understand where I would need direction from the council and likely additional funding if we need to pursue a more complicated, complex analysis.
So Deputy Mayor Weicker has a question before. City Manager Bond, since you're talking about that, you want to just go ahead and sort of discuss sort of the process relative to this report? I mean, again, this is our first look at it, first touch, and presumably it's going to come back to us. You might want to go ahead and explain that
Sure.
process right now.
A couple things for tonight. I really wanted to hear the feedback and the discussion from the city council. This is a draft report. We did, for example, catch an error a couple days ago, so we need to go through and make some corrections. If there are things we can clarify, we will make those modifications and bring it back to you, really just for acceptance that you've received the final report. Council, from there, I will be looking for your direction. Where of these recommendations, what would you like us to pursue? The recommendations around training, those are relatively low-hanging fruit. Doing video conferencing, things like that, the chief could consider. If you would like us, as I already mentioned, to pursue further study of a contract relationship, you would likely need to identify that as a work item and make sure it's properly resourced. These types of analysis can take, several months or more, particularly because we have to work with the other partner to really be able to drill down. So at this point, we plan to bring this back as a final report. At some point, you will need to provide me direction. This is a study session, so I'm not anticipating this will come back though until the fall. And what I would likely be doing is if you want to study further and resource that, we would put that into your budget as a work item and start working towards that in 2021.
Okay. We have a number of hands up. I guess I'm going to take my turn since this is, people have already asked questions. So I guess in terms of the report, as I was reading it, I was struck by, and maybe I was a bit confused, sometimes there would be obviously these national standards in terms of performance, and then you would see how Mercer Island performed, and oftentimes they were not meeting the national standards, but I assumed that there was an explanation for that. I didn't see the explanation in the report, and for instance, I'm guessing in terms of travel time, for instance, part of the problem is our street system, is not squared and it's not flat. So I don't know if that was a factor why sometimes we didn't perform up to the national standards. But I guess for me, it'd be nice to have that very short explanation why that is, and perhaps adopted a different standard from the national standards.
Yeah, and quite frankly, Mr. Mayor, there are very few fire agencies in the country that meet that 4-minute 90% standard. As we go around and do the studies, you don't find that as a normal cost acceptable model for most agencies. It's very difficult to meet because you have to have fire stations so close together. It gets very expensive.
Okay. Well, that might be just a nugget that'd be interesting to put in the report, just as an explanation as somebody who's reading that. I have other things. We also have a number of council members. So Deputy Mayor Weicker.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if there was another point you wanted to make about Bellevue as a potential contracting agency. And then in general, I'd like to hear your thoughts on local control versus contracting, knowing the city is facing significant headwinds and has a unique geography connected to both major employment entertainment spaces by a bridge. So if you could just speak to that specifically around Bellevue and your recommendation to choose them, and kind of what this council should consider as we look at doing our own service and maintaining it locally versus considering contracting.
Yes. So looking at Bellevue, there's a number of things that made them stand out as the best possible contract choice for you guys. One is their proposed cost of providing services is less than your current budget for providing fire services. Two is you've got an existing relationship with Bellevue. The fire department already works with them in a mutual aid and automatic aid capacity. They do the same on the island with the aerial apparatus and then the marine boat agreement that you have with them. So the city's already got that relationship. When I met with the chief over at Bellevue, looking at their established core values, looking at their mission statement, visiting with the chief, and the way he expected his organization to perform and the way they desired to provide service to the community was very similar to what your fire chief was expressing in terms of service levels and customer expectations and meeting those high service level expectations. So culture, they seem like a good fit as well. The big negative is, you know, once you're in one of these contracts, and then that loss of local control, the biggest issue is always at that collective bargaining table. If their personnel negotiate a sizable increase in salary, which isn't uncommon when you look at the way this negotiation happens, they'll say, well, we're in a larger system now. We just took on 2 more stations. We're serving this much more area, you know, so we're not comparable to the same type of community we were before. And, you know, if they're successful at the bargaining table, you have no control over that. So you've, in effect, given up that local control, which is probably the biggest deciding factor for the council is what's more important, you know, saving a few dollars on the short end or maintaining that local control and providing the best services we can afford for our community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Neese?
So in the opening paragraph of the summary, it characterizes the scope of the work as determine if the city can realize greater efficiencies in delivery of fire protection services. And so as I look at the discussion tonight, I'm hearing a large part of discussion around performance of the organization, which to me is not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to figure out how we as a city with limited revenue resources can continue to pay for the cost of local fire department when the cost, the expenses are outpacing our ability to collect the revenues we need to fund it. And so as I look at page 17, which is a summary of calls for service by type from 15 to 19, I look at this and I think, is this data not telling you something that you could make a recommendation towards efficiency? And so, for example, you have medical calls, almost 8,000 in total in the 5 years. And then I look at things that I would consider fires or fire-related calls. So other type of fires, smoke scare, structure fire, vegetation, brush debris fires, vehicle fires, those all add up to 476. So about 8,000 aid calls and 500 fire calls. And then among all the calls, you have 15 or so percent, 1,890 alarm activations, which, you know, I have to think that some part of the organization is expending effort on false alarms that is not represented in the line below it, which says false alarm, because you can possibly have, you know, nearly 2,000 alarm calls and only 500 fires without having some kind of corresponding false alarm number that is the balance. So the question is, if you could create a disincentive for people, you know, to have a false alarm, or if you had a fine, for example, for too many false alarms, would the resources you save by not having to send them to false alarms allow you to have a more efficient fire department that needed, let's say, fewer employees or lower fuel costs or whatever? Is there not an efficiency that is to be gleaned out of this data that could be presented in this report?
So to answer your question, false alarm ordinances are something that cities do adopt for both police and fire. And typically it's warnings for the first up to so many per year, and then a fine structure kicks in. In your fire department specifically, the way you're staffed, there's no way to be more efficient than the way your operations are currently staffed, because you're operating at what's considered the minimally acceptable safe staffing of an engine company at 3-person minimum. And then you've got the battalion chief to make up your 7 people per day. So there'd be no, and your unit utilization isn't so high that it's driving the need for additional resources. So if we saw high unit utilization rates and false alarm calls that were to the point that we thought enacting a false alarm ordinance may bring those down, and now you're going to be able to reduce the number of units that you're staffing and deploying, then that would be a recommendation that makes sense. But by dropping those few hundred calls a year, it's not going to change how you staff and deploy because you're already at the minimum.
So is there not anything to be looked at efficiency-wise when 95% of your calls are aid calls, that part of the responsibility could be parsed out and put into an organization that's focused on aid calls?
But you're using the same personnel to respond to fire calls as your aid calls.
Are you? I mean, I don't know. I'm not supposing what it would look like or wouldn't look like, but you would have trained medical responders responding to medical calls outside of the fire department. I don't know who they would be employed by or who would deliver that service, but it's 95% of the volume.
Councilmember, that's actually 65%. If you look at the report there on page 17, medical calls, it's combined with auto accidents, but it's 65% of the total calls.
Yeah, no, I understand. I'm looking at the data a different way, which is comparing physical fire numbers against just the pure aid call numbers. So it's taking out the 15% and the false alarms, activations, the things that are not core delivery of service, right?
Well, but the activations are, because if it's listed as an alarm activation, the alarm functioned as it was designed, whether it's burnt food on the stove, an oven fire, somebody burning in their fireplace and they forgot to open the flue. The system worked as it was designed, so it's not a false alarm.
No, I understand. But the question is really to the disproportionate number of calls that are aid related rather than fire, and does parsing that service out have some efficiency gain or not?
So when you look at the way you're deployed currently and the difficulties of the road network on the island, you would still need 2 stations. And if you were paying for just aid cars, then you'd be staffing 2 fire engines with 3 personnel like you are today. And it wouldn't change anything except you'd be adding the expense of dedicated personnel for aid cars instead of the cross-staffing model you currently use.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering why that wouldn't be a scenario that would appear in the report as opposed to just an ad hoc discussion. You know, you would have to put pen to paper to say, this has come up before. I'm not asking this because I think this is a novel idea. It was presented in the Prop 1 discussion of possible solutions for the budget crisis, that aid calls could be staffed by a different form of aid technician. And there was some savings ascribed to it back just 2 years ago. So I don't think this is something that is unheard of.
Did our chief have any input into that?
I mean, it came from our city manager at the time, so I assume he did.
So, Councilmember Neese, would you, sounds like your recommendation would be for Robert to perhaps think about that and perhaps incorporate that into the study.
Well, what I don't want is I don't want a study that just steers us to outsourcing to Bellevue or Eastside Fire without exploring all of the efficiencies that could have been taken advantage of to retain local control. And I know we talked about it. I mean, you were on the council at the time. It was not a huge number in the savings column, but maybe that number's changed. I don't know.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Chief Heitman, you were starting to say something. Can you comment on that prior discussion, please, about staffing for aid calls?
I would say that the citizens would get a lesser level of care. Part of that is because all of our EMTs are trained by King County, which is one of the leading EMS services in the world. Also, when you do the privatization, it would probably cost, and I don't know for sure, but it would cost money to have an aid car sitting here on the island, not in use. Those companies are for profit. They don't often leave aid cars sitting in a spot. They go to where feel that they're going to be needed or where the CAD system's directing them to. And so I think you could potentially, yes, they make less hourly, but the level of service would drop significantly.
So to me, it sounds like it's a worthwhile thing to include in the report. I mean, again, I think to Councilmember Nice's point, you know, the council has looked at it in the past. The community has talked about it. It's something that probably just needs to be fleshed out and, you know, actually looked at more thoroughly. But it is consistent with trying to figure out efficiencies and trying to save money for the city and also maintaining the current level of service or trying to improve the level of service. So I'm supportive of trying to expand or have Robert in his next iteration at least address the issue.
Sure, we can do that. I also want to ask, Robert, did you conclude your presentation? And if you did, I'm going to ask you to stop screen sharing so we can go back to full screen here. Ah, there we go. Thank you.
So, thank you. Councilmember Jacobson has had his hand up for a while.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Finn, for your report. After going through it twice, I felt like Peanuts who said, stop, my brain is full. But I have a couple questions, or a question and a comment. Question number one is the breakdown that we have shown on page 17 of total medical and auto versus all fire calls and all rescue calls, is that breakdown fairly representative of what cities our size, number one, and the services other than Seattle that are out there as possibilities?
For a kind of a urbanized suburban area, those numbers are very typical to what you see. Usually we see the medical calls, if it is a fire department that does respond as a first responder or transport agency, somewhere in the 65 to 75% range.
Thank you. My comment is this. My suggestion would be that we engage in a little bifurcation. And there seems to be, as our city manager said, some low-hanging fruit, some things that we could do that don't require us to really do anything other than cost them, that are contained in the report. The decision whether or not to go to outsource is one that strikes me as requiring one hell of a lot of due diligence in terms of contract, in terms of experience of the small sisters, what the big brothers are doing if they're, in a subordinate role, and as Mr. Finn's pointed out, where's collective bargaining go and some things like that. Those aren't insoluble, but those would be all the kinds of things that our city manager said, wait till a budget process, But at any rate, I think there's some things we could proceed on. Chief Heitman, of course, knows that better than I, but there might be some things we could do. And given my understanding of how long the fuse is when we tap someone and say, we'd like you to be a firefighter or a policeman, we would want to be probably making, if we're going to increase the staff, we'd probably be wanting to start getting our, getting into the game at this point.
Thank you. Councilmember Reynolds.
A couple of things. One, just to make an observation that a staffing and services study is about efficiency, and it should be, but let's keep in mind there are two aspects of efficiency. We could be looking at this problem of how do we provide the same level of service for less money, and how do we spend the same amount of money but get better service? And I hope we don't lose track of that other. I think we need to try to have a philosophical discussion about where on the continuum our objective lies. I don't think we've had that yet. But just more generally, I wanted to talk about the outsourcing model. And if we were to pursue something like that in order to cut our costs, it seems like there's a few ways that costs can go down. One is by reduced headcount or equipment, and therefore presumably a decrease in services. One is by, not necessarily, but that would be the obvious answer. One is by reduced administrative overhead or increased efficiency because of the larger scale that Councilmember Neese pointed out, and reduced overtime because of that, and law of large numbers working to our advantage. I believe in that can happen. And the third possibility is that might go either way is if the cost per employee is different in the other jurisdictions. You know, do they have lower or higher salaries, lower or average vacation policies, et cetera, greater or lower levels of average seniority? And I just wonder if you've done any kind of comparisons of those sorts of factors that drive costs in the other jurisdictions, because ultimately, whatever those factors are, they're going to drive our costs.
Yes, no, that kind of detail wasn't included in the scope of work. It was more doing the outreach and just finding out what their estimates were and if there was a potential opportunity for cost savings through a contract.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hope if we decide to pursue that more deeply next year, that we keep something like that within the scope and not just focus on the initial bid, but look at the long-term sustainable cost efficiencies. That why would it be cheaper to be with Bellevue or Eastside Fire?
One thing to keep in mind, Council, I keep hearing is these other departments, it's not like they have this big pool of extra people. There was a point last year where Bellevue, due to retirements, was understaffed. I want to say it was up to 12. So they were having the same overtime issues that we were. Therefore, if we were a part of them, we would be right back in that same model. So again, a lot of it, as Robert pointed out earlier, a lot of it comes down into the contract and how you design that contract that will make that difference.
Thank you.
Mayor Wong, I just wanted to chime in here. You know, having worked for a city that was a contract city for 12 years, we contracted in Sammamish for both police and fire. I need to reiterate, I'm not taking an opinion on whether we should pursue this or not, but the devil's really in the details. As you contemplate, as we head into the fall and begin our budget discussions, as you contemplate whether or not you want to study this, I will just point out that we need the partner agency, whether it's, you know, Bellevue or Eastside Fire and Rescue, or perhaps even Seattle, if they're not off the table, to agree to study it with us. And you know, it's something we need to resource properly to really get into a higher level of analysis. And I appreciate the comments tonight, because the study didn't go quite that deep or that detailed.
And that leads me to my point. I guess this, again, is the initial draft of this study. And so for the council, I guess, and again, for our city manager, this may be outside the initial scope that we gave Mr. Finn. But I'm just curious from the council's perspective, for this study to be of any use in our decision-making process, is there something that's missing in this report right now that you think should be included? You know, one thing that I would like to see, and again, it may be outside the initial scope, is simply throughout the report, we have all these performance standards. I'm just always curious, I made notes about, would option 2, which is the contracting out to another agency, would that actually improve our level of service? And at what cost? I don't know, and it's tough to make any kind of decision or to use the study as a tool in our decision-making process unless we know that either option 2 is better or option 1, which is basically a list of all the other recommendations that have been provided. But to me, that would be helpful in the next iteration, just to have a little bit more direction in terms of whether or not option 1 or option 2 makes any more sense.
Yes, sir.
But again, I'm looking for direction from other council members that you can give to Mr. Finn as he prepares the next iteration of this study.
Yeah, and so, Mr. Mayor, just to let you know, so what Eastside and Bellevue proposed is staffing exactly as you're staffing today. So there's no changes in how you're deployed. There's no changes in effective performance. The only one that changed anything was Seattle coming in and adding an extra person to your engine companies. And what that did, that gets you 2 more people potentially per day that you can get on an emergency scene in a shorter amount of time before the mutual aid partners come in. So really no enhancements to your response time performance. Seattle would just get you more bodies quicker.
The other thing Mr. Finn shared earlier, and this is really important, some cities end up having to make costly decisions to relocate fire stations, is that our stations are largely in the location they should be. So under a contract model, you put the personnel in that same location, and we would expect service levels to be met. So just, you know, this gets back to Councilmember Nisa's comments earlier. There's performance and there's efficiencies. Our performance data shows that we're doing quite well, and I would argue we would not want to compromise in those areas. So what we're looking now at really is other efficiencies.
Okay.
If we need to explicitly, what we can add to the report, Mr. Mayor, is just a more explicit statement about assumptions we would make on contracting and performance levels, where they would lie, essentially.
Okay. Councilmember Reynolds.
Just one question on scope again. It was represented to the staffing and services study, and it seems that the staffing focus so far has been on how many staff to have and what sort of shifts for them to work. And I'm curious to what extent you looked at who the staff are. So for example, I think it's true, and Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we have a single female firefighter on the island. So I'm curious if you looked at that and what the factors driving that are, and if there's anything we could be doing to make that better.
In my career, I've offered a position to 2 different female firefighters, and they chose different departments, citing greater opportunities.
The scope of the study did not include who the staff are, to be clear.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay. Deputy Mayor Weicker.
Okay, so final question, I think. The fire marshal position, did it used to be part of the fire department and then it rolled in? And how would that change if we were to contract out? And what does that mean for any sort of efficiencies we're trying to gain? Would it make more sense to put that position under DSG with a dotted line for the fire department or something like that?
What's DSG? Just
The planning department.
Right.
Oh, okay.
All the codes and building plans.
Yeah. So co-locating those type of positions within planning is not uncommon. And having plan reviewers that have the life safety plan review skill sets to be able to do those types of plan reviews. There's also the ongoing and recurring building inspections and inspections that occur during remodels and construction. So I think the key would be what's the workload on your fire prevention folks in a contract scenario versus what are the capabilities of the contracting agency. So if we examine their workloads and what best practices say the numbers they should be able to do, and there was capacity, then you may not have to necessarily fund as much of that. But if they're at capacity and don't have any more, then once again, you're going to be funding that type of position for your needs on the island.
Well, and I noticed some overtime there, so I don't know if that position backfills some of our fire station work either.
Could I chime in here? I want to make sure we are, I get the right information out there. Our fire marshal is already co-located in our planning department. Under non-pandemic times, he physically sits in the planning department. So he's very much cross-pollinating between the fire department and the planning department. It's one of the better integrations I've ever seen personally in my career. The chief and I were just working on the fire department budget for the next biennium, and I will note there will be some savings in the fire marshal budget due to a reduction in overtime, and maybe the chief can just chime in here and explain, we have some good news stories around fire marshal efficiencies.
Yes, as you know, it's our assistant fire marshal that generates that overtime right now and doing a lot of the residential and some of the commercial plans review. but that is all compensated with permit revenue. So even though it shows in our budget as a cost, we have a revenue stream coming in that covers that. With that, our new fire marshal has put into place some new policies and procedures that have been very effective. And so our processing permits and plan review have gone way down, and that overtime needed even by the assistant fire marshal has dropped, partially due to workload, but partially just due to those efficiencies that his time is not required as much.
So that might be useful to highlight.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Councilmember Neese will have the last question in this study session, but City Manager Bond, if council members have questions, suggestions relative to this study, can we email them to you to forward to Mr. Finn?
Sure. Why don't you email the chief and just copy me?
Okay, all right. Councilmember Neese.
So Robert, on page 52, it talks about the addition of a possible Quint style apparatus. Can you tell me just the approximate cost of that type of apparatus?
So they vary greatly. Typically what you see with a Quint is it's priced somewhere between an engine. So engine companies these days are somewhere between $550 and $700,000, depending on how you customize them. Aerial apparatus can go up to 1.5 million. So that Quint, you'd be looking at somewhere between 800 and 1.2.
So in that paragraph that it mentions the Quint, it says considering the redevelopment of town center, future residential areas, and so on and so forth. So the nexus for the Quint style apparatus is the future development that you think that zoning might contemplate in town center.
Yeah, so it's once you get those 3 structures over 35 feet tall,
yeah,
that's when you really take a big hit by not having an aerial apparatus immediately available.
So one of the recommendations that I don't see in the report is to have a recommendation to fund that capital purchase with fire impact fees, which are allowed under Washington state law. In fact, the city has impact fees for schools, for parks, for transportation. I think the only impact fee they don't have is for fire. It hasn't been a problem here to now because the fire department hasn't been purchasing equipment where the nexus has been new development. But since you're suggesting it, then we should be looking at it because the future development should pay for that equipment, not the existing island residents.
Yeah, we can definitely add some language to that.
And then maybe the chief could speak to who would operate that Quint. Would it be the existing staff? We're not going to fire up a ladder company because we had a Quint, are we?
We would have to, we'd have to cross staff that. It wouldn't have as much access as the current pumpers that we have. It would change our replacement schedule, and it would require a lot more training because aerial apparatus are specialized.
So obviously that recommendation has to come with a little bit more meat on the bone as to the operational cost as well. Because unfortunately, the impact fees will only pay for the equipment. They won't pay for the operation of the equipment.
It would be the same personnel that currently staff the engine.
That's
Basically,
not what I heard. I didn't hear that from the chief.
We would be
I heard that there would be additional cost in at least training and possibly staffing of that equipment.
We would, Councilmember, we would staff it if we chose to cross staff it. Where it limits us is that it doesn't have the access of an engine. So therefore we may have to depend on call type, which apparatus leaves the station with that single crew.
So all I would ask is that maybe in a future version of the report, we get a better fleshed out analysis of that. That's all.
And I'll work with the chief to see.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for this study session. Thank you, Mr. Finn, and to the chief for your time and presentation. Council, we have one item of regular business. I'm hoping we can get to it before we go into our next executive session. So, Council, again, we have one item of regular business. It's the communication on the commuter parking and mixed-use development project. And to lead that discussion, City Manager Jesse Bond.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe somewhere in the background I have Ross Freeman. There he is, our communications manager. So just a reminder, City Council, anytime all 7 of you desire to sign on to a communication, we do need to bring it to a City Council meeting for your approval. So tonight we have a communication regarding the mixed-use commuter parking and mixed-use development project originally planned for the former Tully's site, and a communication that I'll have Ross pull up here. This is a draft message with your approval this evening that will be sent on your behalf to the community.
I wanted to check if that is sharing properly.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Good.
We've had some sharing issues lately. So essentially, I'm not going to read the whole letter. We will amend the packet with this document so that it is available. It will also be sent out this evening with your approval, essentially informing the community that we'll be discussing in the packet material that is going out tomorrow. For the June 21st council meeting, we will be including a resolution confirming the city's decision to part ways with Main Street. And as I'm reading from the second paragraph there, it's essentially over differences. July 21st, did I do that again? Sorry. It's essentially over differences in our project vision that resulted in the parties reaching impasse. I do have a motion for you that I'm happy to read when you're ready.
Go ahead, City Manager.
Sure. The recommended motion is to authorize the publication of the City Council's letter to the community on the subject of ending the city's commuter parking and mixed-use development project substantially in the form presented.
I so move.
Motion to that effect.
I so move.
Second.
So it's been moved by Councilmember Jacobson and seconded by Councilmember Rosenbaum to submit this communication, or I'm not going to repeat the motion, but I take it, City Clerk, you've got it down. And if, assuming that's the case, the City Clerk could take a roll call.
Yes, Mayor. Councilmember Neese,
Aye.
Councilmember Rosenbaum,
Aye.
Councilmember Jacobson,
Aye.
Councilmember Anderall,
Aye.
Councilmember Reynolds,
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Weicker,
Aye.
and Mayor Wong.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Motion passes. We now move to other business. City Manager Vaughn, is there anything else you wish to report at this time?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Next on the agenda is another executive session. The City Council will recess briefly and then go into a executive session for approximately 60 minutes to discuss planning or adopting the strategy or position to be taken by the City Council during the course of any collective bargaining, professional negotiations, or grievance or mediation proceedings, for reviewing the proposals made in the negotiations or proceedings while in the progress pursuant to RCW 42.30.140, paren 4, close paren B, close paren, again, for about 60 minutes. No action will be taken. Please be, and now, there being no other business before council, the time is now 9:02 p.m. and the special meeting is adjourned. Again, council members, please stay seated until the city staff has terminated the broadcast.